Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. Story 1. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 34, and I tied a ribbon at the Blackwater Falls State Park trailhead in West Virginia to mark the way out, and found 3 more I didn't tie. The red fabric fluttered against the weathered trail marker like a wound that wouldn't heal. I stared at it for a long moment, my fingers still clutching the roll of surveyor's tape I'd brought specifically for this purpose. The ribbon I'd just tied was bright orange, unmistakable, but there, dancing in the September wind beside it, were 3 others. 1 blue, 1 yellow, and one that might have been white once but was now the color of old bone. "Sarah, you coming?" David called from behind me, already 20 feet down the trail with our day pack slung over his shoulders. My husband had that eager bounce in his step that he got whenever we went hiking, like a golden retriever who'd spotted a tennis ball. The falls are supposed to be incredible this time of year. I touched the blue ribbon. The fabric felt soft, worn smooth by weather and time. When had someone else stood in this exact spot performing the same ritual? When had they realized they needed to mark their way back to safety? "Just a second," I called back, pulling out my phone to take a picture of the ribbons. The camera focused with a soft click, but when I looked at the screen, only my orange ribbon appeared in the frame. I lowered the phone and looked again. All 4 ribbons were still there, real as the ache in my lower back from sleeping on the RV's questionable mattress. I raised the phone again. Only orange. "Sarah." David's voice had taken on that patient tone that meant he was trying not to be annoyed. We'd been married for 8 years, and I knew all his vocal tells by now. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, sorry, just getting oriented." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and jogged to catch up with him. The trail curved away from the parking area and into the thick canopy of maple and oak that made West Virginia famous in autumn. The leaves were just beginning to turn, splashes of gold and crimson bleeding through the green like watercolors on wet paper. We'd driven the RV up from Charlotte 3 days ago, part of what David called our pre-anniversary adventure. 9 years married next month, and we were still trying to figure out how to be together. The past year had been rough. His job at the firm was consuming him. My mother's death in February had left me hollow and drifting, and somewhere in the middle of grief and stress we'd forgotten how to talk to each other about anything that mattered. The RV trip was supposed to fix that. 2 weeks on the road, just us in the mountains and no cell service to interrupt whatever conversations we needed to have. We'd made it 3 days without a real fight, which felt like progress. "Remember this spot," I said, pointing back toward the trailhead as we walked. "Orange ribbon on the marker post." David glanced over his shoulder without slowing down. "Got it. Though I don't think we'll have trouble finding our way back. It's only a 2-mile loop." Only 2 miles. And that's what everyone always said before they got lost. The trail descended through a corridor of rhododendron bushes, their leathery leaves creating a tunnel of green that filtered the afternoon sunlight into shifting patterns on the path. Our footsteps were muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves, and the only other sounds were the distant rush of water and the occasional call of a wood thrush somewhere in the canopy above. "This is nice," David said, and I could hear the effort he was putting into his enthusiasm. "Quiet, peaceful." I nodded, though something about the silence felt wrong. Not peaceful, expectant. Like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I'd felt this way before, the day my mother died. That morning had been perfectly ordinary until the phone rang at 11:30 a.m., and then everything shifted into a different key. A minor note that made even familiar sounds seem strange and threatening. "Tell me about the falls," I said, trying to shake off the feeling. "You said they're supposed to be famous?" 62 feet, David recited, pulling facts from whatever hiking website he'd consulted. "Named for the dark water caused by tannic acid from fallen hemlocks. There's supposed to be a viewing platform at the top, and then the trail loops down to the base." We walked in comfortable silence for a while, the path switching back and forth as it descended toward the sound of falling water. The trees grew taller and older here, their trunks thick enough that I couldn't have wrapped my arms around them. Hemlocks mixed with the hardwoods, their dark needles adding depth to the shadows. That's when I saw the first one. It was tied to a thin birch sapling about 10 feet off the trail, a strip of red fabric that fluttered in the breeze like a tiny flag. I stopped walking and pointed it out to David. "Look, another ribbon." He followed my gaze and shrugged. "Probably from another hiker. People use them to mark interesting spots, or maybe somebody was doing trail maintenance." But this one looked exactly like one of the ribbons I'd seen at the trailhead, the one that had been white once but was now bone-colored. Except this one was definitely red, the color deep and rich like fresh blood. "Come on," David said. "We're burning daylight." I followed him down the trail but kept glancing back at the ribbon until the trees blocked it from view. The sound of the falls was getting louder now, a constant roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The air was getting cooler too, carrying the sharp scent of wet stone and moss. 10 minutes later, I spotted another ribbon. This one was blue, tied to a branch that hung over the trail at eye level. I had to duck to avoid it, and as I did, the fabric brushed against my cheek. It felt cold and damp, like it had been soaked in something and left to dry. "David, wait." I stopped and looked up at the ribbon. There was something dark staining one corner of it, something that looked brown and crusty against the blue fabric. "What now?" He turned around and I saw the first flash of real irritation cross his face. "Sarah, we've been walking for 20 minutes and you've stopped 3 times. If you don't want to see the falls, we can go back to the RV. I do want to see them. It's just these ribbons. Don't you think it's weird that there are so many of them?" David looked up at the blue ribbon, his expression softening slightly. "Maybe, but people leave all kinds of stuff in the woods. Geocache markers, trail signs, memorial ribbons for people who died here. It doesn't necessarily mean anything sinister. Memorial ribbons for people who died here." The words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't argue with his logic. People did tie ribbons to trees to remember the dead. I'd done it myself, at the park where my mother used to take me as a child. A small purple ribbon for the woman who'd taught me to identify wildflowers and braid my hair and always know which direction was north. "You're right," I said. "Sorry, I guess I'm feeling jumpy today." "It's okay." David reached out and squeezed my shoulder. "I know this time of year is hard for you. September was when your mom got the diagnosis. It was such a simple, understanding thing to say, and it hit me harder than I expected." My eyes filled with tears and I had to look away so he wouldn't see. This was what I'd been missing, this version of David who paid attention to the small, important details of my grief. The man I'd fallen in love with 9 years ago. "Thank you," I whispered. "For what?" "For remembering." He squeezed my shoulder again and we continued down the trail. The sound of the falls was much louder now, and through gaps in the trees I could see flashes of white water tumbling over dark stone. The air was thick with mist and everything felt cool and clean, but I kept seeing ribbons. They were everywhere once I started looking for them, tied to branches, wrapped around tree trunks fluttering from the tips of fern fronds, red, blue, yellow, white, orange, green, a rainbow of fabric markers that someone had scattered through the forest like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Some of them looked fresh, the colors bright and clean. Others were faded and frayed, weathered by months or maybe years of rain and wind and snow. A few were so old they were barely recognizable as fabric at all, just wisps of color clinging to bark like moss. I didn't point them out to David. He was focused on the trail ahead, and I could tell he was excited to reach the falls. But with each ribbon I spotted, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger. This wasn't normal. This wasn't random hikers marking interesting spots or maintenance crews flagging hazards. This was something else. This was deliberate. We reached the viewing platform just as the sun broke through the clouds, turning the falling water into a cascade of liquid silver. Blackwater Falls plunged 62 feet over a cliff of dark sandstone, the water stained brown by tannic acid just like David had said. The mist rose in clouds from the pool at the base, creating tiny rainbows in the afternoon light. "Wow," David breathed, pulling out his phone to take pictures. "This is incredible." It was incredible. It was also wrong. I couldn't put my finger on what bothered me about the scene at first. The falls were exactly as beautiful as advertised. The viewing platform was solid and well-maintained, and the sound of crashing water should have been soothing. But something was off, like a photograph where the shadows fell in the wrong direction. Then I realized what it was. The pool at the base of the falls was perfectly still. Water was thundering down from 60 feet above, tons of it per second. But where it hit the pool, there were no ripples, no spray, no disturbance of any kind. The surface of the water was as smooth as black glass, reflecting the sky like a mirror. "David," I said, pointing down toward the base of the falls, "look at the water." He lowered his phone and followed my gaze. For a moment, he was quiet. Then he frowned. "That's weird. The water's hitting the pool, but it's not making any waves. It's not physically possible," I said. "That much water falling from that height should be churning the pool like a washing machine." David raised his phone again and zoomed in on the base of the falls. "Maybe it's deeper than it looks. Sometimes deep water can absorb impact better." But even as he said it, I could tell he didn't believe it. We stood there for several minutes, watching water crash into a pool that refused to acknowledge its presence. The sound was deafening, but the visual was all wrong, like watching a movie where the audio and video were out of sync. "Let's keep going," I said finally. "The trail loops down to the base, right?" David nodded, still staring at the impossible stillness of the pool. "Yeah, there's supposed to be another viewing area down there." We left the platform and followed the trail as it curved away from the cliff and began descending toward the base of the falls. The path here was steeper and rockier, with wooden steps built into the hillside to prevent erosion. The sound of falling water grew even louder as we descended, until it was difficult to hear each other speak. And the ribbons multiplied. They were thick here, dozens of them tied to every available branch and trunk. The trees looked like they were wearing party decorations, festooned with colorful streamers that danced in the mist-laden air. Some of the ribbons were tied in neat bows, others were just wrapped around branches and knotted. A few were braided together into longer chains that hung between trees like garland. But the strangest thing was that they all looked fresh. Even the ones that should have been weathered and faded by months of exposure were bright and clean, their colors vivid against the dark forest. It was like someone had come through recently and replaced every single one. "Sarah," David said, his voice tight with something between confusion and alarm. "Are you seeing this?" I nodded, unable to speak. There were so many ribbons now that the forest looked like a textile factory had exploded. Every surface was decorated, every branch adorned. The trees themselves seemed to be disappearing under the weight of fabric, becoming abstract sculptures of color and movement. We reached the bottom of the trail and emerged onto a small rocky beach beside the pool. Up close, the water was even more unnerving. It was perfectly black, like liquid obsidian, and so still I could see our reflections in it as clearly as if we were looking into a mirror. The falls thundered down just 20 feet away, but the water where they hit remained undisturbed. "This is impossible," David said, walking to the edge of the pool. "Water doesn't behave like this. It can't." I was more concerned with the ribbons. Here at the base of the falls, they were everywhere, tied to the sparse vegetation that clung to the rocks, wrapped around fallen logs, even floating in the still water like lily pads. And now I could see that some of them had writing on them. I knelt beside the pool and pulled one of the floating ribbons toward me. It was white fabric, about 6 inches long, and someone had written on it in black marker. The ink should have run or faded from exposure to water and weather, but the letters were crisp and dark. Jenny Morrison, age 7. Lost, 9/15/2018. My blood turned cold. I grabbed another ribbon, this one yellow with red writing. Marcus King, age 34. Lost 10/3/2019. And another, blue with black letters. Sarah Davidson, age 29. Lost 8/22/2020. "David," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the falls. "Come look at this." He walked over and knelt beside me as I showed him the ribbons. His face went pale as he read the names and dates. "These are," he started, then stopped. "These are memorials for people who got lost here. Look at the dates, I said, pulling more ribbons from the water. They go back years, decades, some of them. We spent the next 10 minutes collecting ribbons from the pool and the surrounding rocks, reading name after name, date after date. Children and adults, teenagers and seniors, people from all over the country who had somehow vanished in these woods. The dates stretched back to the 1970s, though the ribbons themselves all looked new. But it was the last ribbon I pulled from the water that made my heart stop. This one was orange, the same bright safety orange as the surveyor's tape I'd brought to mark our trail. The writing was in blue ink, in handwriting I recognized. Sarah Chen, age 34. Lost 9/23/2023. Today's date, my name, my age, my handwriting. I dropped the ribbon like it was on fire and it fluttered down to land on the dark water, where it joined the dozens of others floating like a garden of the dead. "David," I said, my voice shaking, "we need to leave. Now." He was staring at the ribbon with my name on it, his face white as bone. "You didn't write that." "No, I didn't." "Then who—" A sound interrupted him. Not the thunder of the falls, but something else. Something that came from the forest behind us, drifting through the trees like smoke. It was singing, a high, sweet voice that seemed to be getting closer. The voice of a child. "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies." David and I looked at each other, and I saw my own terror reflected in his eyes. We both knew, without needing to discuss it, that no child should be singing nursery rhymes alone in these woods. Not with all these memorial ribbons. Not with my name floating in the water. "Ashes, ashes, we all fall down." The voice was definitely getting closer, coming from somewhere up the trail we'd just descended. But there was something wrong with it. Something that made my skin crawl. It was too clear, too perfect, like a recording being played through hidden speakers. "We need to go," I said again, standing up and grabbing David's arm. "Right now." But which way? The trail we'd come down was behind us, in the direction of the singing. The pool blocked our path to the left. To our right, the rocky beach ended in a steep cliff face. Straight ahead, across the pool, I could see what might have been another trail, but we'd have to cross the water to reach it. The singing stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat and David's rapid breathing. Even the falls seemed quieter somehow, as if the water was falling more gently. I looked up at the cascade and felt my stomach drop. The water was falling upward. Not all of it, just a few streams here and there, droplets and ribbons of water that defied gravity and spiraled up toward the sky like smoke. They twisted and danced in the air above the pool, creating impossible waterfalls that flowed in reverse. "David," I whispered. "Look up." He tilted his head back and let out a sharp breath. "What the hell is happening here?" Before I could answer, the child started singing again. But now the voice was coming from a different direction. From across the pool, where I'd seen the other trail. "London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down." And then, from behind us, a second voice joined in harmony. Another child, singing the same song but slightly out of sync, creating an eerie echo effect that seemed to bounce off the rocks and trees. "London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady." A third voice joined from our left, and then a fourth from our right. Soon, the entire forest was filled with the sound of children singing, their voices sweet and pure and completely wrong. The songs overlapped and intertwined, creating a symphony of innocence that made my teeth ache. "We're surrounded," David said, his voice barely a whisper. I counted at least 8 different voices now, maybe more. They seemed to be positioned in a circle around the pool, hidden somewhere in the trees and rocks. But I couldn't see any children. Couldn't see any movement in the forest except for the endless flutter of memorial ribbons. "The water," I said suddenly. "We have to cross the water." David looked at me like I was insane. "Sarah, we don't know how deep it is. And look at it. It's not natural. God knows what's in there." But the singing was getting louder, and I thought I could hear footsteps now. Small feet moving through the fallen leaves, coming closer from all directions. "It's our only option," I said, kicking off my hiking boots. "Stay close to me." I waded into the pool before I could lose my nerve. The water was cold, so cold it made my bones ache, but it was only knee-deep at the edge. The bottom felt strange under my feet, not rocky or muddy, but smooth and soft like walking on skin. David followed reluctantly, cursing under his breath as the icy water soaked through his pants. We moved slowly toward the center of the pool, toward what I hoped was the other shore and another trail out of this nightmare. The singing stopped again. In the sudden quiet, I could hear the water lapping gently against our legs, which should have been impossible given how still the surface had appeared. I looked down and saw our reflections in the black water, but they were wrong. The reflection showed us walking in bright sunlight, smiling and holding hands like we were on a pleasant afternoon stroll. But above the water, the sky was getting darker, and neither of us was smiling. "Don't look down," I told David. "Just keep moving." We were halfway across when the child appeared. She materialized out of the mist near the far shore. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with blonde hair and pigtails and a pink dress that was too clean for someone who'd been lost in the woods. She stood at the edge of the water, watching us with large, dark eyes that seemed too old for her face. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the water. It was the same voice we'd heard singing, sweet and innocent and completely terrifying. David and I stopped walking. The water around us had gotten deeper, now up to our waists, but I was afraid to take another step. The little girl looked real enough, but after everything we'd seen, I didn't trust my eyes anymore. "No," I called back to her. "We're just hiking. Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The little girl tilted her head to one side like a curious bird. "I don't remember my parents. I've been here a long time." "What's your name?" David asked. "Jenny," she said. "Jenny Morrison." The name hit me like a physical blow. I'd read it on one of the ribbons. Jenny Morrison, age 7, lost 9/15/2018. 5 years ago. "Jenny," I said carefully, "we're going to come over there and help you find your way home, okay?" But as we started moving toward shore again, more children appeared. They stepped out from behind trees and rocks, materialized from shadows and mist, until there were at least a dozen of them standing along the water's edge. Boys and girls of different ages, all wearing clothes that looked too clean and new, all watching us with those same dark, ancient eyes. "We don't go home," one of them said, a boy with red hair and freckles. "We stay here. We wait." "What do you wait for?" David asked. "For new friends," Jenny said, smiling for the first time. Her teeth were perfectly white and far too sharp. "Like you." The water around us suddenly felt thicker, more viscous, like we were wading through syrup instead of water. I tried to take another step toward shore, but my legs moved as if in slow motion. Beside me, David was struggling too, his face twisted with effort and fear. "Sarah," he gasped. I can't move." I looked down at the water and saw that our reflections were gone. The surface was still mirror smooth, but it reflected only sky now, as if we had become transparent. And I could feel something moving around our legs, something soft and clingy that wrapped around our ankles like hands. "Let us go," I shouted at the children on the shore. "But you're lost," Jenny said, her voice full of false sympathy. "Just like we were. And when you're lost in these woods, you don't leave. You stay, and you help others find their way." The truth hit me then, cold and absolute. These weren't children. They were echoes, remnants of all the people who had vanished in these woods over the years. Trapped somehow, condemned to lure others into the same fate. And the ribbons. The ribbons were markers. Not memorials for the dead, but advertisements for the lost. Bait to draw in new victims. I thought of the orange ribbon floating in the water with my name on it, written in my own handwriting. Had I really written it in some future version of events where I was already trapped here? Or was this place capable of creating its own reality, its own twisted version of cause and effect? The water was up to our chests now, though we hadn't moved deeper. It was rising around us, or we were sinking into it. I couldn't tell which. The dark surface lapped at my chin, and I had to tilt my head back to breathe. "David," I whispered. "The ribbon, my ribbon. When did I write it?" His eyes were wide with panic and understanding. "You haven't. Not yet. Then maybe we can change it. Maybe it doesn't have to happen." I thought about my mother, about the purple ribbon I'd tied for her in that childhood park, about memory and loss and the things we carry with us, about the weight of grief and how it could drag you down if you let it, but also about love, about the way David had remembered the anniversary of my mother's diagnosis, about the small kindnesses that kept us tethered to life and to each other. I reached for his hand under the water and found it, our fingers interlocking with desperate strength. "I love you," I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in months. "I love you too," he replied, squeezing my hand so tight it hurt. And something shifted. The water around us lightened slightly, becoming less black and more brown, the natural tannic color David had read about. The children on the shore flickered like old film, their edges becoming indistinct. Jenny's voice called out to us, but it sounded farther away now, as if she was receding into the past where she belonged. "Don't leave us," she pleaded. "We've been alone so long." "You don't have to be alone," I called back, though I could barely keep my mouth above water now. "You can go too. You can let go." For a moment I thought I saw something else in Jenny's dark eyes. Not hunger or malice, but relief. A flicker of the real child she had been before this place claimed her. Then she smiled, a genuine smile this time, and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered and faded away like morning mist. The other children followed, disappearing one by one until the shore was empty except for trees and rocks and the endless flutter of memorial ribbons. The water around us began to move again, becoming less viscous, and I felt my feet touch solid ground. We hauled ourselves out of the pool on the far shore, gasping and shaking from cold and terror. Behind us, Blackwater Falls thundered down into water that now churned and foamed exactly as it should. The impossible upward streams were gone, the mirror-still surface was broken, and everything looked normal again. Almost everything. The ribbons were still there, hundreds of them tied throughout the forest, but now they looked different, older, more weathered, like they'd been hanging here for years instead of being freshly placed. And as I watched, they began to fade, their colors bleeding away until they were just wisps of colorless fabric clinging to bark and branch. Then they were gone entirely, leaving only the natural forest behind. "The trail," David said, pointing to a barely visible path that led away from the pool into the trees. There, we found our way back to the RV as the sun was setting, following a trail that seemed to know where we needed to go. Neither of us spoke during the hike. We were too exhausted, too overwhelmed by what we'd experienced. But we held hands the entire way, our fingers interlocked like a lifeline. It wasn't until we were safe inside the RV, with the doors locked and the heat running, that I remembered to check the trailhead marker. The orange ribbon I'd tied there that morning was gone. But that didn't surprise me anymore. What did surprise me was the small piece of paper tucked under one of the windshield wipers of our RV. I found it when I went outside to bring in our wet hiking clothes. It was a list of names and dates, written in my handwriting. Jenny Morrison, age 7. Lost 9/15/2018. Marcus King, age 34. Lost 10/3/2019. Sarah Davidson, age 29. Lost 8/22/2020. And dozens more going back decades. At the bottom of the list, in different ink, someone had written, "Not lost anymore." "Thank you." I showed the paper to David, and we sat together on the RV's small couch, trying to make sense of what had happened to us. Had we really encountered the spirits of people who'd died in those woods? Had we somehow helped them find peace? Or had we simply shared an elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and grief and the power of suggestion? In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that we'd come through it together, that we'd chosen love over fear when it counted most. The experience had shaken something loose between us, broken down barriers we'd built without realizing it. We talked that night in a way we hadn't talked in months, about loss and love and the weight of memory. About my mother and David's fears about his job and our marriage and the future we wanted to build together. We talked until the sun came up, and when we finally fell asleep in each other's arms, it felt like coming home. We left West Virginia the next morning, but we kept driving for another week, following back roads through Virginia and North Carolina and Tennessee. No destination in mind, just the two of us and the open road and conversations that lasted for hours. The ribbons never came up again. We didn't need to discuss what had happened at Blackwater Falls. We both knew it had been real, in whatever way reality mattered. The important thing was what we'd learned there, about holding on to each other when everything else fell away. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about those children in the forest. I wonder if we really helped them move on, or if they're still there, waiting for the next lost hikers to stumble into their web of memorial ribbons and impossible water. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone on a dark road, I catch glimpses of colored fabric tied to roadside trees. Just for a second, in the corner of my eye, before I turn to look and see nothing but bare branches and shadow. I always keep driving when that happens. I don't stop to investigate. Don't get out to check if the ribbons are real or imagined, because I learned something important in those West Virginia woods. Some memories are meant to be carried, but others are meant to be left behind. The question is knowing which is which. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 34, and I tied a ribbon at Blackwater Falls to mark the way out. I found my way home, but I'm not sure I'll ever stop looking over my shoulder for the ribbons I didn't tie. I'm Sarah. I'm 34. I said I wasn't afraid of Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas, and the forest heard me. That's what I told my husband Jake when he suggested we skip the camping trip altogether. Come on, I'd laughed, loading our sleeping bags into the RV. It's just trees and rocks. What's the worst that could happen? Famous last words, as they say. Jake had been hesitant about the whole thing from the start. We'd borrowed his brother's RV for our anniversary weekend. 25 feet of aluminum and optimism that now felt more like a coffin on wheels as we pulled into the campground. The autumn light was already dying, painting the Arkansas hills in shades of rust and shadow. Site 47, Jake read from the reservation slip, squinting through the windshield. Should be just around this bend. Devil's Den had always been on our bucket list. The park's reputation for strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances only made it more appealing to us. We were the kind of couple who binged paranormal documentaries and argued about whether Bigfoot was real. Jake was a skeptic. I was the believer. It made for interesting conversations. Our campsite sat at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by towering oak and pine trees that seemed to lean inward like they were listening to secrets. The famous sandstone formations that gave the park its name loomed in the distance, their weathered faces catching the last of the daylight. Pretty isolated, Jake observed as he killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound. No traffic, no neighbors, just the whisper of wind through leaves. That's the point, I said, already unbuckling my seatbelt. No distractions, just us and nature. The setup went smoothly enough. Jake was methodical about these things, leveling the RV, connecting the hookups, checking and double-checking everything. I busied myself organizing our gear and planning our hikes for the weekend. We had 3 days. I wanted to make them count. By the time we'd finished, full darkness had settled over the campground like a heavy blanket. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees, and our breath made little puffs of vapor in the air. Jake built a fire in the metal ring while I rummaged through our food supplies. "Hot dogs or burgers?" I called from inside the RV. "Hot dogs," he replied. "Easier cleanup." I grabbed the package from the small refrigerator and headed back outside. Jake had gotten a good blaze going, the flames dancing and crackling in the ring. The fire's glow created a small circle of warmth and light around our campsite. But beyond that circle, the darkness seemed absolute. "Listen," Jake said suddenly, holding up a hand. I paused, a hot dog halfway to the fire. The silence was complete. No insects, no birds, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the wind had died. "Weird," I said. "Must be the cold." But it wasn't that cold. Not cold enough to silence everything. We cooked our dinner and ate it by firelight, talking quietly about our plans for tomorrow. We'd brought trail maps and guidebooks, had researched the best hiking spots in the area. The Butterfield hiking trail was supposed to be spectacular, winding through the heart of the park and offering views of the valley below. Should we head back inside Jake asked around 10 o'clock. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the silence around us had grown so thick it felt oppressive. Yeah, I agreed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the tree line. Early start tomorrow. We doused the fire and retreated to the RV. The aluminum walls felt thin and fragile, barely separating us from whatever waited in the darkness outside. Jake locked the door, something he never did when we camped, and we settled into the small bed at the back of the vehicle. I fell asleep to the sound of my own heartbeat. I woke sometime after midnight to Jake shaking my shoulder. "Sarah," he whispered urgently. "Do you hear that?" I sat up, instantly alert. Outside the RV, something was moving through our campsite. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the vehicle. But they weren't quite right. The rhythm was off, like someone learning to walk for the first time. "Probably just a raccoon," I whispered back, but my voice shook. The footsteps stopped directly outside our bedroom window. We could hear breathing now, deep, ragged breaths that fogged the glass. Jake reached for his phone to turn on the flashlight, but I grabbed his wrist. "Don't," I mouthed. We sat frozen for what felt like hours, listening to whatever was outside our window. Finally, the breathing stopped, and the footsteps resumed their slow circuit around the RV. They made 3 complete loops before fading into the forest. Neither of us slept after that. Dawn brought relief and embarrassment in equal measure. In the morning light, our terror seemed ridiculous. We found tracks around the RV, definitely animal, probably a large dog or coyote. Jake pointed out how the soft earth had distorted the prints, making them seem larger and more human-like than they actually were. "See," he said, kneeling beside one of the clearer tracks. 4 toes, not 5, and look at these claw marks. I wanted to believe him. The rational part of my brain knew he was right, but I couldn't shake the memory of that breathing, the too human rhythm of those footsteps. We decided to stick to the plan. After breakfast, we loaded our day packs and headed for the Butterfield Trail. The morning was crisp and clear, perfect hiking weather. The trail began just a quarter-mile from our campsite, marked by a wooden sign that listed the various rules and regulations. "No camping beyond designated areas," Jake read aloud. "Stay on marked trails. Report any unusual wildlife activity to park rangers." "Unusual how?" I asked. He shrugged. "Aggressive behavior, I guess. Animals acting sick or strange." The trail started easy enough, a well-maintained path that wound gradually upward through dense forest. We made good time, stopping occasionally to consult our map or take pictures of interesting rock formations. The exercise felt good after our sleepless night, and my paranoia from the previous evening began to fade. About 2 miles in, we reached a fork in the trail. According to our map, the left path led to an overlook with panoramic views of the valley. The right path was shorter but steeper, climbing toward the park's most famous feature, a massive sandstone arch known as Devil's Den Mouth. "Left or right?" Jake asked, consulting the map. "Right," I decided. "We can hit the overlook on the way back." The path to Devil's Den Mouth was rougher than the main trail, more of a scramble than a hike. We picked our way over loose rocks and fallen logs, following occasional trail markers nailed to trees. The forest grew denser as we climbed, the canopy so thick that it blocked out most of the sky. That's when we first noticed the silence. It was the same profound quiet we'd experienced at our campsite the night before. No birds, no insects, no sound except our own breathing and the crunch of leaves under our boots. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. "This is strange," Jake said, pausing to look around. "It's like the whole forest is holding its breath." I was about to agree when we heard it, voices echoing from somewhere ahead of us on the trail. Laughing and talking, growing closer. "Other hikers," Jake said with obvious relief. "Thank God. I was starting to think we were the only people in the park." The voices grew louder, and soon we could make out individual words. A woman was complaining about blisters, and a man was reassuring her that they were almost back to the parking area. Normal hiking conversation. We rounded a bend in the trail and saw them. A couple about our age wearing matching red jackets and carrying expensive-looking camera gear. They smiled and waved as we approached. Beautiful morning for a hike, the woman called out. Absolutely, I replied. How's the trail ahead? Gorgeous, the man said. Devil's Den mouth is incredible. You'll love it. They passed us with friendly nods and continued down the trail toward the trailhead. Jake and I resumed our climb, energized by the human contact. See, Jake said. Nothing to worry about, just other tourists enjoying the park. We reached Devil's Den mouth about an hour later. The sandstone arch was indeed impressive, a natural window in the rock face that framed a perfect view of the valley below. We spent 20 minutes taking pictures and eating granola bars, enjoying the warmth of the sun on our faces. The hike back should have been routine. The trail was easier going downhill and we'd already covered the route once. But something was wrong. This doesn't look right, Jake said, stopping to examine a trail marker. We should have hit that fork by now. I checked my watch. We'd been hiking downhill for 45 minutes, longer than it had taken us to reach the arch, and the landscape around us looked different somehow, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly how. Maybe we took a wrong turn, I suggested, though I couldn't remember seeing any other paths. Jake pulled out his phone to check the GPS, but the screen showed no signal. We were in a dead zone, common enough in the Arkansas hills. He consulted our paper map instead, trying to orient ourselves by the surrounding terrain. We should be here, he said, pointing to a spot on the map. But I don't recognize any of these landmarks. That's when we heard the voices again. The same voices, having the same conversation. A woman complaining about blisters, a man reassuring her that they were almost back to the parking area. The words were identical, delivered in exactly the same tone and rhythm as before. Jake and I exchanged glances. My skin crawled with a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Maybe they turned around, Jake said weakly, decided to hike the loop again. But we both knew that wasn't right. The voices were coming from the same direction as before, growing closer with each word. Soon we could see them through the trees. The same couple in matching red jackets, wearing the same expressions, carrying the same camera gear. They smiled and waved as they approached, just like before. Beautiful morning for a hike, the woman called out. I opened my mouth to respond, but Jake grabbed my arm. Don't, he whispered urgently. The couple passed us with friendly nods and continued down the trail. As soon as they were out of sight, Jake pulled me off the path and into the dense forest. We need to get back to the RV, he said. Now. What's happening? I asked, though part of me already knew. The rational part of my brain was screaming that there had to be an explanation, but the deeper, more primitive part recognized the truth. I don't know, Jake said, but we're not sticking around to find out. We crashed through the underbrush, abandoning the trail entirely. Branches tore at our clothes and scratched our faces, but we didn't slow down. Behind us, echoing through the trees, we could hear the voices starting up again. The same conversation, word for word. It took us 2 hours to find our way back to the campground. By the time we stumbled out of the forest, we were both exhausted and bloodied from our bushwhacking adventure. The RV sat exactly where we'd left it, looking absurdly normal in the afternoon sunlight. Pack everything, Jake said. We're leaving. I didn't argue. While Jake disconnected the hookups and stowed the gear, I threw our belongings into bags with shaking hands. The silence of the forest pressed against us like a living thing, and I found myself glancing repeatedly at the tree line, expecting to see red jackets moving between the trees. We were almost ready to go when I realized I'd left my hiking boots by the fire ring. They were expensive boots, barely broken in, and we'd need them for future trips. Against my better judgment, I jogged over to retrieve them. That's when I saw the footprints. They were pressed deep into the soft earth around our campsite. The same prints we'd found that morning, but fresh. Whatever had circled our RV the night before had returned during our hike, but these tracks were different somehow, more deliberate, almost like they'd been arranged in a pattern. I knelt for a closer look and felt my stomach lurch. The prints formed a perfect circle around where Jake was working, about 20 feet in diameter, and in the center of the circle, scratched into the dirt with something sharp, was a message. Stay. Sarah, Jake called from the RV. What are you doing? We need to go. I grabbed my boots and ran back to the vehicle, slamming the door behind me. Jake was already in the driver's seat, the engine running. "What's wrong?" he asked, seeing my face. I told him about the prints, about the message. His hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. "Probably just some kids messing around," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We drove toward the park exit in silence, both of us glancing in the mirrors to make sure nothing was following us. The access road wound through dense forest for about 3 miles before reaching the main highway. We were almost there when Jake slammed on the brakes. "What the hell?" Ahead of us, blocking the road, was a massive oak tree. It lay across the asphalt like a fallen giant, its trunk easily 4 feet in diameter. There was no way around it. The forest pressed too close on both sides. "Must have fallen during the night," Jake said. But we both knew that wasn't true. There had been no wind, no storm, and the tree looked like it had been cut, not blown down. The break in the trunk was too clean, too precise. Jake put the RV in reverse and began backing down the narrow road. There was another exit on the far side of the park, a longer route, but our only option now. "This is insane," I muttered, watching the fallen tree recede in the side mirror. "Trees don't just fall across roads." "Park Service will clear it in the morning," Jake said. "Probably happens all the time." But his voice was tight with the same fear I felt. We both knew this wasn't normal. The alternate route took us deeper into the park, past campgrounds and day-use areas that stood empty in the late afternoon light. The road was narrower here, barely wide enough for our RV, and in several places, overhanging branches scraped against the roof with fingernail sounds that made us both flinch. We'd been driving for 20 minutes when we saw the trail marker. It was the same wooden sign we'd passed that morning at the start of the Butterfield Trail, with the same list of rules and regulations. But that was impossible. The trailhead was miles behind us, back near our campsite. "Stop the RV," I said. Jake pulled over and we both got out to examine the sign. It was identical to the one we'd seen earlier, down to the smallest detail. Even the weathering patterns in the wood were the same. "This doesn't make sense," Jake said. "We've been driving away from the trail. We should be nowhere near it." I walked a few steps down the path beyond the sign. It looked exactly like the trail we'd hiked that morning. The same rocks, the same fallen log, even the same pattern of leaves on the ground. "Jake," I said slowly, "I think we're in trouble." He joined me at the trailhead, his face pale in the fading light. "This has to be a different trail. They probably all look similar." But we both knew better. This was the same trail, which meant either the park's geography made no sense, or something was very wrong with our perception of it. "Let's just keep driving," Jake said. "We'll find the main road eventually." We climbed back into the RV and continued down the winding park road. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Long shadows stretched across the asphalt like reaching fingers. After another hour of driving, we saw our campsite. It sat in its clearing exactly as we'd left it, the fire ring still warm with the ashes of our breakfast fire. The RV's tire tracks were clearly visible in the soft earth, and my hiking boots still lay scattered by the picnic table where I'd dropped them in my haste to pack. "That's impossible," Jake whispered. We'd been driving in a straight line for over an hour, following signs that clearly pointed toward the park exit. There was no way we could have circled back to our original location. "Get us out of here," I said. "I don't care how. Just drive." Jake put the RV in reverse and began backing away from the campsite. This time, he didn't bother with the roads. He drove across grass and gravel, following his compass rather than the marked routes. We bounced and lurched over rough terrain, the RV's suspension groaning with every bump. But after 20 minutes of cross-country driving, we emerged from a stand of trees to find ourselves back at the same campsite. "No," Jake said, pounding the steering wheel. "No, no, no." The sun had fully set now, and our headlights cut pale swaths through the gathering darkness. In their glow, I could see the message scratched into the dirt near the fire ring. "Stay." But now there were more words beneath it, carved in the same rough letters. "You belong. Here now." "We need to call for help," I said, fumbling for my phone. No signal, not even one bar. Jake tried his phone with the same result. We were completely cut off from the outside world. trapped in a pocket of space that seemed to fold back on itself no matter which direction we traveled. "The radio," Jake said suddenly. "The RV has an emergency radio." He rushed to the small communications panel and began scanning through frequencies, searching for any sign of human contact. Static filled the cabin, punctuated by brief bursts of garbled voices that might have been distant stations, or might have been something else entirely. Then, clear as day, we heard our own voices. "Beautiful morning for a hike," my voice said through the radio speaker. "Absolutely," Jake's voice replied. "How's the trail ahead?" It was our conversation with the couple in red jackets, recorded and played back with perfect clarity. But that was impossible. No one had been recording us, and the conversation had happened miles from any radio equipment. Jake frantically spun the dial, trying to find another station, but every frequency carried the same loop of audio. Our voices having the same conversation over and over again. "Turn it off," I said. He switched off the radio, but the voices continued. They were coming from outside now, drifting through the forest around our campsite. Multiple conversations overlapping. Every word we'd spoken since arriving at the park played back in an endless loop. "We need to get out of this RV," I said. "If we stay here, we're sitting ducks." "Where can we go?" Jake asked. "Every direction leads back here." He was right, but I couldn't stand the thought of sitting passively while whatever was happening to us continued to unfold. I grabbed our day packs and started stuffing them with supplies. Water, energy bars, first aid kit, flashlights. "We hike out," I said. "Cross country, no trails. We find the park boundary and follow it until we reach civilization." It was a desperate plan, but it was better than doing nothing. Jake helped me pack while our voices continued to echo from the forest around us, a ghostly chorus of our own words. We were almost ready to leave when we heard the footsteps. They started at the edge of the campsite and began their slow circuit around the RV, just like the night before. But this time, we could see what was making them. It was us. Jake and I stood frozen inside the RV, watching ourselves walk slowly around the vehicle. The other versions looked exactly like us. Same clothes, same faces, same hiking gear. But their movements were slightly off, like actors who hadn't quite learned their parts. "This isn't real," Jake whispered. "This can't be real." The other Sarah completed her circuit and stopped outside our window. She turned to face the RV, and I found myself looking into my own eyes. But they were wrong, somehow. Too bright, too aware. She smiled, and I saw that her teeth were stained with something dark. "Sarah," the other Jake called from somewhere behind the RV. "Do you hear that?" It was the same words Jake had spoken to wake me the night before, delivered in exactly the same tone and inflection. The loop was starting again. The other, Sarah, pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass. When she spoke, her voice was my voice, but the words were different. "We've been waiting for you," she said. "For so long." That broke our paralysis. Jake grabbed the keys and we bolted for the RV's door. The other versions of ourselves made no move to stop us as we ran into the forest, crashing through underbrush in blind panic. Behind us, we could hear them starting their conversation again. "Sarah," the other Jake's voice drifted through the trees. "Do you hear that?" We ran for what felt like hours, stumbling over roots and rocks in the darkness. Our flashlights carved weak cones of light through the forest, but they seemed to make the shadows deeper rather than dispelling them. Eventually, exhaustion forced us to stop. We collapsed beside a small stream, gasping for breath and trying to process what we'd seen. "Doppelgangers," I panted. "That's what they were. Shapeshifters. Skinwalkers. Those are just stories," Jake said, but his voice shook. "Native American legends. They're not real. Then explain what we just saw." He couldn't, and we both knew it. Whatever was happening to us, it lay outside the boundaries of rational explanation. We followed the stream, hoping it would lead us out of the park. Water always flows downhill, toward larger bodies of water, toward civilization. It was basic geography. But after an hour of walking, the stream led us to a familiar clearing. Our campsite sat exactly as we'd left it, the RV's windows glowing with warm light. And there, moving around the vehicle in their endless circuit, were the other versions of ourselves. "This is impossible," Jake said. We've been walking downstream. We should be miles away by now." I knelt beside the stream and tasted the water. It was flowing uphill. "The laws of physics don't apply here," I said, "or they apply differently. We're not in the normal world anymore. Then how do we get back?" I didn't have an answer. We were trapped in a pocket reality that followed its own rules, a loop of space and time that fed on repetition. Every choice we made, every word we spoke was being recorded and played back, adding to the strange echo chamber that surrounded us. The other, Sarah, looked up from her circuit and waved at us. Her smile was wider now, and I could see more dark stains on her teeth. "She's changing," I whispered. "Whatever that thing is, it's not a perfect copy. It's degrading." As if she'd heard me, the other Sarah's smile faltered. For a moment, her face flickered like a bad television signal, revealing something else underneath. Something with too many teeth and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "We can't let them touch us," I said, backing away from the clearing. "If they touch us, we might become like them." We retreated into the forest, but everywhere we went we found traces of ourselves. Footprints in the soft earth, scratches on tree bark where we'd steadied ourselves, even candy bar wrappers we'd dropped during our earlier hike. Our presence was spreading through the park like an infection, marking every surface we touched, and with each trace we found, we heard our voices echoing from deeper in the woods. Not just recent conversations, but memories from years past, arguments we'd had in our apartment, jokes we'd shared on previous camping trips, even intimate moments we'd thought were private. "It's learning us," Jake said with growing horror. "Studying us, building a complete record of who we are. So it can replace us," I finished. We were being harvested, our personalities and memories copied and absorbed by something that fed on human identity. And with each repetition of our words and actions, the original versions, us, became less real, less important. By dawn, we'd given up trying to escape. Every direction led back to our campsite. Every stream flowed uphill. Every trail formed a perfect circle. We were mice in a maze designed by something that thought in loops and recursions. We sat on a fallen log at the edge of our clearing, watching the other versions of ourselves go through their morning routine. They cooked breakfast over the fire ring, consulted trail maps, and discussed their plans for the day. It was a perfect recreation of our first morning in the park, down to the smallest gesture. But the details were wrong. The other Sarah cracked eggs with her left hand instead of her right. The other Jake put sugar in his coffee instead of drinking it black. Small differences that suggested the copying process wasn't perfect. "Maybe that's how we get out," I said. "We break the pattern. Do something unexpected, something the loop can't account for." Like what? I thought about it. Every action we'd taken since arriving at the park had been recorded and replayed. Our conversations, our hiking route, even our panic and attempts to escape, all of it had become part of the loop. But there was one thing we hadn't tried. "We go back," I said, "to the beginning, to the moment when I said I wasn't afraid." Jake stared at me. "That's insane. We'll be walking right into its trap." "We're already in its trap," I pointed out. "But maybe if we acknowledge our fear, admit that we were wrong, it will let us go." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. We walked back to our campsite, past the other versions of ourselves who continued their endless pantomime of our first day. They didn't seem to notice us, or perhaps they were focused on replaying our recorded actions and couldn't deviate from the script. The RV sat where we'd left it, covered now with a thin layer of frost that shouldn't have been possible in the mild Arkansas autumn. The message in the dirt had grown longer. "Stay. You belong here. Now we are learning soon we will be complete." I stood where I'd stood when we first arrived, looking out at the forest that had seemed so welcoming just 2 days ago. "I was wrong," I said aloud. "I was afraid. I am afraid." The words echoed through the trees, but these echoes were different, fainter, as if the forest were losing its grip on them. "I was wrong, too," Jake added. "I thought there were rational explanations for everything, but some things can't be explained." The other versions of ourselves stopped their routine and turned to look at us. Their faces were changing now, melting and reforming like wax in a fire. The masks were slipping, revealing the hungry intelligence that wore our shapes. "We don't belong here," I continued. "We're just tourists, visitors. We'll leave and never come back." The things that looked like us began to move toward us, their movements jerky and unnatural. But with each step, they became less solid, more transparent. "Please," Jake said, and I could hear tears in his voice. "Just let us go home." The forest around us shuddered, like a photograph being shaken. The colors bled and ran together, the solid shapes of trees and rocks becoming fluid and uncertain. For a moment, I thought we were falling through reality itself, tumbling into some deeper level of nightmare. Then we were sitting in our car in the parking lot of a truck stop, the morning sun warming our faces through the windshield. "Sarah," Jake said uncertainly, "where are we?" I looked around, trying to orient myself. The truck stop was on Interstate 40, about 50 miles east of Devil's Den State Park. Our camping gear was piled in the back seat, and according to the dashboard clock, it was Saturday morning, the day we were supposed to check into the campground. "I think we're going home," I said. Jake started the engine without another word. We drove in silence for the first hour, both of us afraid that talking might somehow break whatever spell had released us. It wasn't until we crossed the state line into Oklahoma that I finally spoke. "Do you remember what happened?" "Parts of it," Jake said. "Like a bad dream that you can't quite shake. The loop, the other versions of us, that message in the dirt." I nodded. The memories were already fading, becoming indistinct and dreamlike. But the fear remained, a cold knot in my stomach that I knew would never fully go away. "We're never going back there," I said. "Never," Jake agreed. But even as we drove toward home in safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out of that forest. In the rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of a face that looked like mine, but wasn't quite right. In my peripheral vision, I saw Jake's hands on the steering wheel, but the wedding ring was on the wrong finger. Small differences, copying, errors. The thing in Devil's Den had let us go, but not unchanged. Part of us was still back there, trapped in the endless loop, while something else had taken our place in the real world. I reached over and took Jake's hand, studying his face in the morning light. His eyes met mine, and for just a moment, I saw something else looking back at me. Something hungry and patient and not quite human. Then he smiled, the same smile I'd loved for 10 years, and I told myself I was imagining things. But sometimes, late at night, I hear us having conversations I don't remember. Jake cooking breakfast with the wrong hand or humming songs he's never heard before. Little glitches in the program, small signs that what came back with us from Devil's Den isn't entirely what went in. And every morning, I wake up a little less certain about which version of myself is real. The loop never really ended. It just got bigger, expanding to include our normal life, our daily routines, our quiet moments of doubt. We escaped Devil's Den, but Devil's Den didn't escape us. "We are learning," the message had said. "Soon we will be complete." I think it already is. Story 3. My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm 34, and I followed a birdsong into Pisgah National Forest and learned it wasn't a bird. The RV's engine wheezed to a stop at the Davidson River campground, and I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel like it might anchor me to something solid. Behind me, Sarah was already unbuckling herself from the dinette seat, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon light streaming through the windshield. "God, Marcus, I can't believe we actually did this," she said, stretching her arms above her head. "When's the last time we went camping? College?" "Something like that." I killed the ignition and listened to the engine tick as it cooled. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have, pressing against the RV's thin walls like water against a dam. Through the windshield, Pisgah National Forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a cathedral of ancient hardwoods and towering pines that had been standing since before the Cherokee walked these mountains. The campground sat in a natural clearing beside the Davidson River, and even from inside the RV, I could hear the water running over smooth stones, a sound that should have been peaceful, but somehow wasn't. Sarah was already moving toward the back of the RV, pulling supplies from cabinets with the efficiency of someone trying to stay busy. "I'll start setting up the outdoor stuff if you want to check us in." Sure. I grabbed the paperwork from the dashboard and stepped outside, immediately hit by the crisp mountain air. October in North Carolina carried the smell of dying leaves and wood smoke, but underneath it was something else. Something that made my sinuses burn like I'd walked into a cloud of ozone. The camp host's trailer sat at the entrance to the loop. A faded blue single-wide with flower boxes that had seen better days. An elderly man emerged before I'd even reached the door, as if he'd been watching through the window. His skin was the color of old leather, deeply lined from decades of mountain sun, and his eyes were the pale blue of winter sky. "You, the Thorn party?" he asked, though I hadn't said a word. "That's right, Marcus Thorn. We reserved Site 12 for 3 nights. He nodded and held out a weathered hand. "Name's Elijah Crow. I run things here." His grip was stronger than expected, calloused and warm. "You folks picked a good time to visit. Most of the tourists cleared out after Labor Day. We like the quiet," I said, pulling out my wallet. Elijah's eyes studied my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Quiet's good. Quiet's safe." He paused, still holding my gaze. "You hear anything out there that don't sound right, you come find me. Day or night, understand." "What kind of things?" "Oh, you know. Coyotes sometimes get bold. Black bears preparing for winter." He handed me a camp map with our site circled in red. "But mainly, if you hear someone calling your name in the woods, especially after dark." He let the sentence hang there. "What about it? Don't answer. Don't go looking. Whatever's calling, it ain't who you think it is." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Has there been some kind of problem?" Elijah shrugged, but his pale eyes never left mine. "Just old mountain wisdom, son. These woods been here a long time. They got their own ways." He pointed toward the river. "Your site's right along the water. Real pretty. Just remember what I told you." I walked back to the RV feeling like I'd swallowed something cold and sharp. Sarah had already deployed the awning and was setting up camp chairs around a fire ring made of stacked stones. She looked up as I approached, her green eyes bright with excitement. "This place is amazing, Marcus. Listen to that river. And look." She pointed toward the tree line where the Davidson River curved out of sight. "There's a trail that follows the water. We should hike it tomorrow." "Maybe." I handed her the camp map. "The host seems a little eccentric." "Eccentric how?" "Just some weird warnings about not answering if we hear voices in the woods." Sarah laughed, a sound that should have lightened the mood but somehow made the silence that followed feel deeper. "Probably just trying to scare the city folks. You know how these mountain people are." But I kept thinking about Elijah's eyes, the way they'd held mine like he was trying to communicate something beyond words. The way he'd said, "Whatever's calling, it ain't who you think it is," with the certainty of someone who'd learned that lesson the hard way. The sun was setting by the time we'd finished setting up camp. Our RV sat on a level gravel pad surrounded by mature oaks and maples, their leaves a riot of gold and crimson that seemed to glow in the dying light. The Davidson River ran maybe 30 yards away, its voice a constant murmur that rose and fell like breathing. Sarah had insisted on cooking dinner over the campfire. Hot dogs and beans, simple camping food that tasted like childhood. We ate as the last light faded from the sky, and the forest around us came alive with the sounds of night. Owls called from the canopy, their voices echoing off the mountainsides. Something large crashed through the underbrush downstream, probably a deer heading to water. "This is perfect," Sarah said, leaning back in her chair with a satisfied sigh. "No phone service, no internet, no distractions, just us and nature." I nodded, but I was listening to the sounds beyond the firelight. The woods seemed to be having a conversation with themselves, a constant exchange of rustling leaves and snapping twigs that formed patterns I couldn't quite grasp. Every few minutes the river would change its tone, as if something had altered its flow. "You're being weird," Sarah said. "What do you mean?" "You keep looking over your shoulder. It's just trees, Marcus." She was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness between those trees was looking back. "Sorry. I guess I'm more used to city noise than I thought." Sarah reached over and took my hand. Her skin was warm from the fire, soft and familiar. "Remember why we're here. We need this, both of us. I squeezed her fingers, thinking about the fights we'd been having, the long silences that had grown between us like weeds. This trip was supposed to be a reset, a chance to remember what we'd built together before work and routine, and the general erosion of daily life had worn us down to strangers sharing a mortgage. "You're right," I said. "I'm here." Present tense. But even as I said it, I was listening to something that sounded almost like music coming from upstream, a melody without words that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. When I focused on it directly, it vanished. But the moment I turned my attention elsewhere, it returned, hauntingly beautiful and completely out of place. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Sarah tilted her head, listening. "The river?" "No, something else. Like singing?" She was quiet for a long moment, then shook her head. "Just water over rocks, babe. Maybe some night birds." But I could still hear it. Faint, but persistent. And it seemed to be moving closer. We banked the fire around 10 and retreated to the RV. The interior felt warm and safe after the vast darkness outside, all honey-colored wood and soft fabric that smelled like home. Sarah curled up against me in the bed above the cab, her breathing deep and even within minutes. I lay there listening to the forest symphony outside our thin walls. The sound I'd thought was singing had stopped, but now there was something else. A rhythmic tapping that seemed to circle the RV like someone walking around the perimeter, testing windows and doors. Probably just branches in the wind, I told myself. Or maybe a raccoon investigating our campsite for scraps. But the sound was too regular, too purposeful. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, 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 pause. Always the same rhythm, always moving in the same direction. I slipped out of bed carefully, trying not to wake Sarah, and crept to the window above the dinette. The campground was lit by a quarter moon that cast everything in silver and shadow. Our fire ring glowed with the faint red of dying embers, but beyond that, the darkness was absolute. The tapping sound stopped. I pressed my face to the glass, trying to see into the shadows between the trees. Nothing moved except the river, its surface catching occasional glints of moonlight like scattered coins. The silence stretched until my ears began to ring. Then I heard my name. "Marcus!" It came from the direction of the river, spoken so softly I almost thought I'd imagined it. A woman's voice, familiar but somehow wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Marcus!" There it was again, clearer this time. My heart started hammering against my ribs. It sounded like Sarah, but Sarah was asleep beside me, her breathing unchanged. I looked back at the bed. In the dim light filtering through the windows, I could see her form under the covers, still and peaceful. Definitely asleep. "Marcus, come here." The voice was definitely coming from outside, from somewhere near the water's edge. It had Sarah's cadence, her slight southern accent, but there was something underneath it, a quality that made my skin crawl, like hearing your own voice played back on a recording and realizing it doesn't sound the way you thought it did. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter and stepped toward the door, then stopped. Elijah's words echoed in my mind. If you hear someone calling your name in the woods, especially after dark, don't answer. Don't go looking. Whatever's calling, it ain't who you think it is. "Marcus, please, I need you." The voice was closer now, maybe just outside the RV. It carried a note of distress that made every instinct scream at me to help. But Sarah was still asleep, still breathing evenly in the bed behind me. I stood frozen in the narrow aisle of the RV, flashlight heavy in my sweating palm. The voice called again, and this time I heard something else underneath it. A wet, sliding sound, like something being dragged through mud. The handle of the RV door turned. I backed away as the door swung open, revealing a rectangle of night sky and the pale outline of the trees beyond. A figure stood on the bottom step, silhouetted against the moonlight. It had Sarah's height, Sarah's general shape, but something was wrong with the proportions. The arms were too long, hanging almost to the knees. The head was tilted at an angle that should have broken the neck. "Marcus," it said in Sarah's voice, "why won't you come to me?" I fumbled for the light switch, but before I could find it, the thing stepped into the RV. In the darkness, I could only make out its outline, but that was enough. It moved wrong, joints bending in directions that weren't possible, each step accompanied by that wet sliding sound. "Sarah," I whispered, backing toward the bed. The real Sarah stirred, opening her eyes. "Marcus, what's wrong?" I spun toward her, then back toward the door. The figure was gone. The RV door hung open, letting in the cold night air and the sound of the river. I started, then stopped. How could I explain what I'd seen without sounding insane? Sarah sat up, instantly alert. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Someone was trying to get in. It was the safest version of the truth I could manage. She was out of bed in seconds, grabbing a robe. "Where?" "The door. I heard someone calling my name, and then the door opened." We checked the campsite together, flashlights cutting through the darkness. There were no footprints around the RV, no signs that anyone had been there. The fire ring was cold, our camp chairs still arranged in their neat circle. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. "Maybe you were dreaming," Sarah suggested gently. I wanted to believe that. Dreams made sense. Dreams didn't leave you feeling like something fundamental about the world had shifted while you weren't looking. "Maybe," I said, but I knew I hadn't been dreaming. And as we walked back to the RV, I caught something in my peripheral vision. A pale figure standing between the trees at the edge of our site, watching us with Sarah's face and arms that hung like broken wings. When I turned to look directly, it was gone. The next morning brought coffee and pancakes and the kind of golden sunlight that made the previous night feel like a fever dream. Sarah was in excellent spirits, chattering about the hiking trail she wanted to explore while she cooked breakfast on the camp stove. The forest around us looked benign in the daylight, just trees and rocks and the cheerful sound of the river. "I'm thinking we follow the Davidson River Trail upstream," she said, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. "The map shows it connects to some waterfalls about 3 miles in." "Sounds good." I was nursing my second cup of coffee, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was just a combination of exhaustion and unfamiliar surroundings. People saw things in the dark all the time. Shadows played tricks. The mind filled in gaps with fear. But I couldn't forget the way that thing had moved, or the sound of Sarah's voice coming from something that definitely wasn't Sarah. We packed day packs with water and trail mix and set out around 9. The Davidson River Trail was well maintained, following the water through groves of rhododendron and mountain laurel. The morning air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and the faint sweetness of wildflowers that hadn't yet surrendered to frost. Sarah was in her element, stopping every few minutes to photograph interesting rock formations or unusual trees. She'd always been the naturalist in our relationship, the one who could identify bird calls and knew which mushrooms were safe to touch. Watching her move through the forest with easy confidence, I felt some of my tension begin to ease. "Look at this," she called from ahead, crouching beside a massive oak that had fallen across a small creek. "You can see where lightning hit it. Must have been decades ago." I joined her, admiring the way the trunk had split down its length, creating a natural bridge over the water. Moss and ferns had colonized the dead wood, turning it into a garden that seemed to glow green in the filtered sunlight. "It's beautiful," I said, and meant it. Sarah smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her in weeks. This is what we needed. Time to just be present, together. We continued upstream, the trail winding through increasingly dense forest. The Davidson River carved a deep channel through granite bedrock, creating pools and rapids that filled the air with the sound of moving water. Every few hundred yards, smaller streams joined the main flow, each one adding its voice to the symphony. It was on one of these tributary streams that I first heard it, a sound that made me stop dead in the middle of the trail. Birdsong, but not quite right. Too complex, too structured. It rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost like language, coming from somewhere in the canopy above us. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Sarah paused, listening. "What, the birds?" "That one in particular, the one that sounds like—" I trailed off because I couldn't finish the sentence without sounding crazy. The bird sounded like it was mimicking human speech, running through fragments of conversation in a voice that was almost familiar. "Sounds like what?" Sarah prompted. The birdsong stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of water over stones. "Nothing," I said. "Never mind." But as we continued up the trail, I kept listening for it. And every few minutes, there it was. The same complex melody that seemed to hover just on the edge of meaning. Sometimes it sounded like words. Sometimes it sounded like Sarah's laugh. Sometimes it sounded like my own voice calling her name. By the time we reached the waterfalls, I was jumpy as a cat. Every snapping twig made me turn around. Every shadow between the trees looked like it might be hiding something. Sarah noticed my nervousness but attributed it to being out of practice with wilderness hiking. The falls themselves were spectacular. A series of cascades dropping 50 feet through a gorge carved from solid granite. Mist filled the air, creating tiny rainbows in the sunlight and leaving everything damp and green. We ate lunch on a boulder overlooking the main pool, watching water striders dance across the surface. "This is perfect," Sarah said, leaning against my shoulder. "I'm so glad we did this." I wrapped my arm around her, breathing in the scent of her hair mixed with pine and water. For a moment, the world felt solid again. Normal, just two people sharing a beautiful place. Then I heard the birdsong again, coming from directly above us. I looked up to see a crow perched on a dead branch maybe 20 feet overhead. It was watching us with bright black eyes, its head tilted at an angle that seemed almost curious. Nothing unusual about that. Crows were intelligent birds, known for studying humans. But when it opened its beak, what came out wasn't a caw. "Marcus," it said in Sarah's voice. I jerked upright so violently that Sarah spilled her water bottle. "What's wrong?" she asked. The crow was still there, still watching us, but now it was making normal crow sounds, harsh caws that echoed off the canyon walls. "Did you hear that bird just now?" I asked. "Of course, it's right above us. What did it sound like to you?" Sarah gave me a look that suggested she was starting to worry about my mental state. "Like a crow, Marcus. What else would it sound like?" But I knew what I'd heard. Clear as day, that bird had spoken my name in Sarah's voice. And as I watched, it tilted its head the other way and spoke again. "Come here," it said. The words perfectly formed despite coming from a beak never designed for human speech. Sarah didn't react at all, which meant she wasn't hearing it. Only I was. The crow launched itself from the branch and flew upstream, disappearing around a bend in the canyon. But its voice seemed to linger in the air, calling my name over and over in tones that shifted between Sarah's voice and something else. Something older and hungrier. We started back down the trail around 2, giving ourselves plenty of time to reach camp before dark. The return hike should have been easier, downhill most of the way following the same path we'd taken up. But somehow we kept missing turns. The first time it happened, I assumed I'd simply gotten distracted. We came to a fork in the trail that I didn't remember from the morning hike, with paths leading both left and right. The right fork followed the river. The left climbed away from the water toward a ridge. "Which way?" Sarah asked. I consulted the trail map, trying to orient myself. According to the diagram, the Davidson River Trail was a simple out-and-back route with no major junctions. But here we were, standing at a clear fork with wooden trail markers pointing in both directions. "This is weird," I said. "This intersection isn't on the map." Sarah looked over my shoulder. Maybe it's a newer trail, or maybe the map's just simplified. We took the right fork, following the river as logic dictated. But within minutes we came to another junction, and then another. Each time I was certain we hadn't passed these intersections on the way up, but there they were. Clear, well-maintained trails heading off in directions that didn't match our map. "Are we lost?" Sarah asked after the fourth unexpected junction. I stopped and pulled out my compass, then cursed under my breath. The needle was spinning slowly, unable to find magnetic north. I tapped the case, thinking maybe there was an air bubble, but the needle continued its lazy rotation. "The compass is broken," I said. Sarah checked her watch. "We've been hiking for over an hour. We should have reached the trailhead by now." She was right. The morning hike to the falls had taken 2 hours, but most of that was uphill. Coming back should have been faster, not slower. I looked around, trying to find familiar landmarks. The forest looked the same in every direction. Oak and maple and pine, rhododendron understory, rocky outcroppings covered in moss. The sound of the river was constant, but I couldn't tell if we were still following the Davidson or if we'd somehow ended up on a different stream entirely. "Let's just keep following the water," I said. "All streams in this area eventually lead back to the campground." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure it was true. And the birdsong that had been haunting me all day was getting louder, more insistent. Sometimes it came from the canopy above us. Sometimes it seemed to originate from the forest floor. And always, it sounded like voices I recognized speaking words I couldn't quite understand. Another hour passed. The sun was getting lower, slanting through the trees at an angle that told me we were running out of daylight. Sarah was trying to stay positive, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Maybe we should stop and call for help," she suggested. I checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising in the mountains, but even more concerning was the time display. According to my phone, it was nearly 6 o'clock. We'd left the falls at 2. There was no way we'd been hiking for 4 hours. "This doesn't make sense," I said, showing Sarah the time. She checked her own phone, frowning. "Mine says the same thing, but that can't be right." The forest around us was growing darker as the sun sank toward the horizon. Soon it would be full dark and the temperature would drop into the 40s. We had water and some trail mix, but no camping gear, no warm clothes, no source of light except our phones. That's when we heard the voices. "Sarah! Marcus!" The call came from somewhere ahead of us, echoing through the trees. It sounded like search and rescue, multiple voices calling our names in the organized pattern of people conducting a grid search. "Over here!" Sarah shouted back, relief evident in her voice. "We're over here!" We hurried toward the sound, crashing through underbrush in our eagerness to reach our rescuers. The voices continued calling, always seeming to come from just ahead, just around the next tree or over the next rise. "Sarah, Marcus, where are you?" But as we got closer, something about the voices began to bother me. They were too similar, like the same person calling our names over and over rather than multiple searchers. And there was that same quality I'd noticed in the birdsong, familiar but wrong, like hearing a recording of yourself played through a broken speaker. "Wait," I said, grabbing Sarah's arm. "What?" "They're right ahead of us. Listen to the voices. Really listen." Sarah stopped, tilting her head. The calls continued, but now that we were standing still, it was easier to hear the pattern. The same voice repeating our names in the same sequence. No variation, no natural conversation between searchers. "That's odd," Sarah admitted. "Marcus! Sarah!" the voice called again, and this time I recognized it. It was my own voice, perfectly reproduced but hollow somehow, like an echo of an echo. "Sarah! Marcus!" And that was Sarah's voice calling back to us, but Sarah was standing right beside me, her mouth closed. We stood frozen in the growing darkness, listening to our own voices calling to us from the forest. The sound seemed to come from all directions now, surrounding us with a chorus of ourselves. "We need to get out of here," I whispered. Sarah nodded, her face pale in the dying light. "Which way?" That's when I realized we were completely lost. The river was somewhere behind us, but I couldn't hear it anymore. The trail we'd been following had vanished into the undergrowth. We were standing in a small clearing surrounded by trees that all looked identical in the gathering gloom. The voices stopped calling. In the sudden silence, I could hear Sarah's breathing, fast and shallow with fear. My own heart was hammering so hard I was surprised it wasn't audible. Then, from somewhere very close, came the sound of laughter. Not the warm, familiar sound of Sarah's laugh, but something that only resembled it. Too high, too long, with an edge that made my teeth ache. "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her voice shaking. The laughter stopped, replaced by something worse, the sound of movement in the trees around us. Not the random rustling of wind through leaves, but purposeful motion. Something large moving through the canopy, branch to branch, circling us. I pulled out my phone and activated the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the surrounding trees. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving through the branches. Human-shaped but wrong, with limbs that bent in impossible directions. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Sarah was pressed against my back, her fingers clutching my jacket. See what? But when I turned the light back to where the thing had been, there was nothing. Just trees and darkness and the growing certainty that we were not alone. "We need to move," I said. "Pick a direction and keep going until we find the river." We stumbled through the forest, following my phone's weak light. Every few steps, I thought I heard something moving parallel to us, keeping pace but staying just out of sight. Branches snapped under invisible weight. Leaves rustled without wind. And all the while, that birdsong continued, sometimes far away, sometimes so close it seemed to be coming from inside my own head. A melody that was almost words, almost meaning, but never quite either. After what felt like hours of blind navigation, we finally heard the sound of moving water. We crashed through a stand of rhododendron and emerged on the bank of a stream, though I couldn't tell if it was the Davidson River or one of its tributaries. "Thank God," Sarah breathed. I knelt beside the water, cupping some in my hands to drink. It was ice cold and tasted of minerals and earth, exactly what mountain stream water should taste like. But as I lowered my head to drink, I caught sight of our reflection in the dark water. There were 3 of us. I jerked back from the stream, water spilling through my fingers. In the phone's light, I could see Sarah kneeling beside me, but in the reflection, there had been someone else. A third figure crouched between us, watching us with eyes that were too bright and a smile that was too wide. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked. I shone the light down at the water's surface, but now it only showed the 2 of us, our faces pale and frightened in the reflected glow. "Nothing," I said. "I thought I saw something, but I knew what I'd seen." And as we followed the stream downstream, I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Something pale keeping pace with us on the opposite bank, always just outside the reach of our light. The stream led us eventually to a wider waterway that I recognized as the Davidson River. From there, it was a matter of following the current until we saw the lights of the campground through the trees. We emerged from the forest like refugees from a war zone, dirty and scratched and shaking with exhaustion. Our RV sat exactly where we'd left it, awning deployed, camp chairs arranged around the cold fire ring. It looked impossibly normal after what we'd been through, a beacon of civilization in the vast darkness of the forest. "I'm never hiking again," Sarah said as we stumbled toward the door. I was about to agree when I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water. There were fresh footprints around our campsite. Dozens of them, all different sizes, forming rough circles around the RV like people had been dancing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that some of the prints were mine. I recognized the tread pattern of my hiking boots, the slightly worn spot on the left heel where I favored that leg. But I'd been with Sarah all day, lost in the forest. I couldn't have made those tracks. "Sarah," I said quietly, "what now?" She was already at the RV door, keys in hand. "Look at the ground around the campsite." She followed my gaze, taking in the churned earth and multiple footprints. Other campers, maybe. People exploring while we were gone? But even as she said it, I could see in her face that she didn't believe it. The prints were too fresh, too numerous, and some of them were clearly ours. Our boots, our stride length, our particular way of walking. We hurried inside the RV and locked the door behind us, though I wasn't sure what good that would do against something that could perfectly mimic our voices and apparently our footprints as well. "I'm calling the Park Service," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "There's no signal, remember?" She checked anyway, then threw the phone down in frustration. "So what do we do?" "We wait for morning, then we pack up and leave." Sarah nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The rational part of my mind was already working on explanations. Mass hysteria, carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty RV heater, some kind of shared psychological break brought on by stress and unfamiliar surroundings. But the primal part of my brain, the part that had kept my ancestors alive when the world was all teeth and claws and hungry darkness, knew better. We had encountered something in these woods that didn't follow the rules I'd built my life around. Something that could wear our voices like masks and leave our footprints in the earth while we were miles away. We heated soup on the camp stove and ate in relative silence, both of us jumping at every small sound from outside. The forest seemed to be having a conversation with itself, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, the distant call of an owl that might not have been an owl at all. Around 10, Sarah curled up in the bed above the cab, exhausted by the day's ordeal. I told her I'd join her in a few minutes, but I knew I wouldn't be sleeping. Instead, I sat in the driver's seat, watching the darkness beyond our windows and trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. The footprints bothered me most. Everything else could potentially be explained as hallucination or misperception, but footprints were physical evidence that something had been here, something that could replicate not just our voices, but our very selves. That's when I heard Sarah calling my name. "Marcus!" Her voice drifted through the thin walls of the RV. "Come outside. I want to show you something." I looked back at the bed. Sarah was there, a motionless lump under the covers, her breathing deep and even with sleep. "Marcus!" the voice called again, more insistent now. "Please, I found something you need to see." I crept to the window above the dinette and peered out. A figure stood at the edge of our campsite, silhouetted against the darkness of the trees. It had Sarah's height and build, but something was wrong with the proportions. The arms hung too low, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Marcus, why won't you come to me?" The thing that looked like Sarah took a step closer to the RV, and I could see that its feet didn't quite touch the ground. It moved with a gliding motion that made my stomach turn. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voice continued calling, sometimes from one side of the RV, sometimes from another, as if the thing was circling us. "Marcus, I'm scared. Something's wrong with me." And that was the worst part. The genuine distress in the voice, the perfect reproduction of Sarah's fear. If I hadn't been able to see her sleeping form in the bed behind me, I would have rushed outside to help her. The calling continued for maybe an hour, accompanied by the sound of something scratching at the RV's exterior walls. Long, deliberate scrapes that might have been fingernails on aluminum, or claws, or something else entirely. Then, just before midnight, everything went quiet. I stayed at the window for another hour, watching for movement, but the forest had returned to its normal symphony of insects and night birds. Whatever had been calling to me was gone. For now, when I finally crawled into bed beside Sarah, she stirred and mumbled something in her sleep. For a moment, her eyes opened and looked directly at me, but there was no recognition in them, no awareness. Just a blank, unblinking stare that lasted too long and seemed to see right through me. Then she closed her eyes and returned to normal breathing, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined that unsettling moment of contact. I didn't sleep at all that night. Morning came with the sound of rain pattering against the RV's roof, a steady autumn drizzle that turned the world gray and reduced visibility to maybe 50 yards. Sarah woke in an excellent mood, chattering about coffee and breakfast as if the previous day had been perfectly normal. "Sleep well?" she asked, pulling on a robe. "Fine," I lied. "Good, I was thinking we could explore some of the shorter trails today. Maybe that nature walk the map mentioned?" I stared at her, looking for any sign that she remembered getting lost in the woods, or the voices calling our names, or the terror we'd both felt as darkness closed around us. But her face showed nothing but cheerful anticipation for another day of vacation. "Don't you think we should head home?" I asked carefully. "Home? Why? We just got here." She was making coffee now, humming a tune I didn't recognize. Besides, the weather's supposed to clear up this afternoon. "Sarah, about yesterday." "What about it?" "The waterfalls were beautiful. I got some great photos." She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through images. "Look at this one of you on the boulder, and this one of the main cascade." I looked at the photos she was showing me. They were indeed from yesterday's hike, but they showed a completely different experience than what I remembered. In every image we looked relaxed and happy. There were no signs of the confusion or fear that had dominated the day. According to her camera, we'd had a perfectly normal hiking experience. "Do you remember getting lost?" I asked. Sarah laughed. "Lost? Marcus, we followed a clearly marked trail there and back. Took us maybe 4 hours total." She gave me a concerned look. "Are you feeling okay? You seem really anxious." I wanted to argue. to insist that we'd been lost for hours, that we'd heard voices calling our names, that something had been stalking us through the forest. But looking at her photos, at her genuine confusion, I began to doubt my own memories. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was the stress of our relationship problems manifesting as paranoid delusions? "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired, I guess." But I wasn't fine. As Sarah bustled around making breakfast, I noticed things that hadn't been there the night before. Mud on her hiking boots that didn't match the soil around our campsite. Scratches on her arms that she didn't seem to notice. And when she turned away from me, I caught a glimpse of something in her hair. A small twig with leaves that weren't from any tree I'd seen in this area. "Where did you get that?" I asked, pointing to the foreign vegetation. Sarah reached up and pulled the twig from her hair, examining it with mild curiosity. "Huh. Must have picked it up yesterday." She tossed it out the door without another thought, but I kept staring at where it had been, because the leaves on that twig had been moving, not swaying in a breeze. There was no wind inside the RV, moving with deliberate, purposeful motion, like tiny hands grasping at the air. After breakfast, Sarah insisted on taking that nature walk she'd mentioned. The rain had stopped, leaving everything dripping and glistening in the gray morning light. I didn't want to leave the relative safety of the RV, but I couldn't think of a reason to refuse that wouldn't sound insane. The nature trail was a short loop that started near the camp host's trailer and wound through a grove of old-growth hemlocks. Interpretive signs along the way identified various plants and explained the ecology of the Appalachian forest. It should have been peaceful, educational, completely benign. But within minutes of starting the walk, I heard it again. That birdsong that wasn't quite birdsong, complex and structured and almost like language. It seemed to follow us as we moved along the trail, coming from different trees, but always just overhead. "Do you hear that bird?" I asked Sarah. She paused, listening. "What bird?" The sound stopped immediately, leaving only the drip of water from wet branches and the distant murmur of the river. "Nothing," I said. "Never mind." We continued along the trail, stopping to read the interpretive signs and admire particularly large trees. Sarah seemed completely at ease, but I felt like we were being watched. Every few minutes I caught movement in my peripheral vision, a pale shape flitting between the trees, always vanishing when I turned to look directly. At the halfway point of the loop, we came to a small clearing with a bench facing a particularly impressive hemlock that the sign claimed was over 400 years old. Sarah sat down to rest, pulling out her water bottle. "Isn't this nice?" she said. "So peaceful." I nodded, but I was studying the tree line around the clearing. The shapes between the trunks seemed wrong somehow, as if the shadows were deeper than they should be. And that birdsong had started again, coming from the ancient hemlock itself. "Sarah," I said quietly, "I think we should head back." "Already? We're barely halfway around the loop. I have a bad feeling about this place." She gave me that concerned look again. "Marcus, you've been acting strange since we got here. What's wrong?" How could I explain that the forest itself felt malevolent? That I kept hearing voices that sounded like us but weren't us? That something was wearing our forms and leaving our footprints in the earth? "I think maybe I'm coming down with something," I said, feeling a little feverish. Sarah immediately switched into caretaker mode, pressing her hand to my forehead and fussing over me. "You do feel warm. Let's get you back to the RV." But as we stood to leave, I heard something that made my blood freeze. From somewhere in the trees around the clearing came the sound of clapping, slow, rhythmic applause, as if something had been enjoying our performance. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Sarah was already walking back toward the trailhead. "Hear what?" The clapping continued, moving around the perimeter of the clearing like an audience member circling for a better view. But every time I turned toward the sound, it seemed to come from a different direction. We hurried back along the trail, Sarah chattering about getting me some aspirin and maybe making soup for lunch. But I kept looking over my shoulder, and once I swore I saw something following us. A tall, pale figure that moved from tree to tree with unnatural fluidity, always staying just at the edge of my vision. By the time we reached the RV, I was shaking with more than just fever. Sarah bustled around, making me comfortable on the couch and bringing me tea with honey. But every kindness she showed me felt wrong somehow, as if she was following a script rather than acting from genuine concern. "You should rest," she said, tucking a blanket around me. "I'm going to walk down to the camp host and see if he has any cold medicine." "Don't go," I said, grabbing her wrist. "Please, just stay here with me." She looked down at my hand on her arm, and for just a moment her expression changed. The concern vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. Her eyes seemed to focus on me as if she was seeing me for the first time. Then the moment passed, and she was back to normal. Warm, caring, completely Sarah. "Of course," she said. "I'll stay right here." But when she sat down beside me, I noticed that her skin was cold despite the warmth of the day, and when she spoke, there was the faintest echo to her words, as if they were being repeated by someone else a fraction of a second later. I closed my eyes and pretended to sleep, but I was listening to every sound she made. The soft rustle of her clothing as she moved, the almost inaudible whisper of her breathing, and underneath it all, something else, a wet, sliding sound that seemed to come from inside her body. When I opened my eyes an hour later, Sarah was sitting in exactly the same position, staring at me with an expression of patient hunger. She hadn't moved at all while I'd been sleeping. Hadn't shifted her weight, hadn't changed position, hadn't even blinked as far as I could tell. "Feeling better?" she asked, and her voice was perfectly normal except for that faint echo. "A little," I lied. "Good. I was thinking we could take a drive this afternoon. Explore some of the scenic overlooks." The idea of being trapped in a car with whatever this thing was made my stomach turn. "Actually, I'm thinking we should pack up and head home. I'm not feeling well enough to enjoy the trip." Sarah's face went very still. "But we just got here. We planned this for months." "I know, but you're being ridiculous, Marcus." Her voice had changed, becoming flatter, more monotone. "We're staying. You'll feel better tomorrow." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, delivered with an authority that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "You're right. I'll feel better tomorrow." Sarah smiled, but it was wrong. Too wide, showing too many teeth. "Good. I'm so glad we agree." That night I waited until Sarah was asleep before creeping out of the RV. I had to know what we were dealing with. Had to find some way to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The camp host had warned me about voices in the woods, which meant he knew something about what was happening here. Elijah's trailer was dark except for a small light in one window. I knocked softly on the door, hoping I wouldn't wake him but desperate enough to risk it. The door opened immediately, as if he'd been waiting for me. "Wondered when you'd come," he said, stepping aside to let me in. The trailer's interior was sparse but clean, with the kind of functional furniture that suggested a man who'd lived alone for a long time. What caught my attention were the walls, covered with newspaper clippings, photographs, and what looked like hand-drawn maps. "You know what's happening to us," I said. Elijah nodded, pouring 2 cups of coffee from a pot that seemed to be perpetually brewing. "Seen it before. Not often, but often enough." "What is it?" "Mimics," he said simply. "Things that copy. Started showing up in these woods maybe 20 years ago, after they built that new development up on Bald Mountain. Disturbed something that should have been left alone." I looked at the newspaper clippings on the wall. Most were about missing hikers, unexplained disappearances, people who'd gone into the forest and never come out. But some were stranger. Reports of people who'd returned from camping trips changed somehow, acting in ways their families didn't recognize. "What do they want?" I asked. "Same thing any parasite wants, a host." Elijah sipped his coffee, studying me over the rim of his cup. "They copy voices first, then behavior, then physical form. Eventually, they don't need the original anymore." "You're saying Sarah isn't Sarah?" "I'm saying you better figure that out real quick, son. Because if she's been replaced, it won't be long before you are too." He pulled out a hand-drawn map and spread it on the small table between us. It showed the campground and surrounding forest, but with additions that weren't on any official map. Trails that led nowhere, areas marked with warnings, and a large red X on the slope of Bald Mountain. "That's where they nest," he said, pointing to the X. Old Cherokee hunting ground. Sacred site before the white settlers came and built their houses on top of it. The Cherokee knew to leave it alone. We weren't so smart. How do I know if Sarah's been replaced? Test her. Ask her something only the real Sarah would know. But be careful. They learn fast. And once they know you're on to them... He shrugged. What happens then? Then you better hope you can run faster than they can copy. I studied the map, memorizing the locations of the marked trails and danger areas. Is there a way to stop them? Fire, Elijah said. They don't like fire. Iron works too sometimes. But your best bet is to get out of these woods before they decide they're done playing with you. Why are you helping me? The old man's pale eyes grew distant. Because I lost my wife to them, 40 years ago. Brought her camping up on Bald Mountain for our anniversary. She came back wrong, and I was too stupid to realize it until it was too late. He gestured toward one of the photographs on the wall. A faded color print of a smiling woman with kind eyes. Lived with that thing wearing her face for 3 months before I figured it out. What did you do? What I had to do. His voice was flat, emotionless, and I've been watching these woods ever since, trying to warn folks. Most don't listen. I finished my coffee and stood to leave. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Elijah said. Just get out alive. That'll be thanks enough. I slipped back to the RV as quietly as I could, my mind racing with everything the old man had told me. Mimics that could copy human form. A nest on Bald Mountain. Fire and iron as weapons against them. And the question that was burning in my gut. Was the woman sleeping in my bed? Really Sarah? Or something wearing her face? I crept back into the RV and stood over the bed, studying the figure under the covers. In the dim light filtering through the windows, she looked exactly like Sarah. Same hair, same facial features, same way of curling up on her side when she slept. But something was off about her breathing. Too regular, too controlled. Like someone consciously maintaining a rhythm rather than the unconscious patterns of genuine sleep. I needed to test her, but carefully. If she really was some kind of mimic, I couldn't let her know I was suspicious. Sarah, I whispered softly. No response. Sarah, are you awake? The figure stirred, rolling over to face me. Her eyes opened, but they seemed to reflect light like an animal's, just for a moment before becoming normally human again. Marcus, what's wrong? Her voice was perfect, exactly Sarah's sleepy tone, her slight accent, the way she always sounded concerned when I woke her up. But that echo was still there, faint but unmistakable once you knew to listen for it. Bad dream, I said. Go back to sleep. She smiled and closed her eyes, immediately returning to that too regular breathing pattern. I sat in the driver's seat for the rest of the night, watching her and planning. If this thing really wasn't Sarah, then where was the real Sarah? Was she dead, or was she trapped somewhere, maybe in that nest on Bald Mountain? And how long did I have before the mimics decided they were done playing games? As dawn broke gray and misty over the campground, I made my decision. I was going to find that nest, and I was going to find out what had happened to the real Sarah. Even if it killed me. The thing that looked like Sarah woke with the sunrise, stretching and yawning in a perfect imitation of her morning routine. But I noticed she didn't actually blink away sleep the way people do when they first wake up. Her eyes were immediately alert, focused, as if she'd been awake all along. Beautiful morning, she said, looking out the window at the mist-shrouded forest. Yeah, listen, I'm feeling better. Want to try a longer hike today? Really? You seemed so sick yesterday. Mountain air must be helping. I was thinking we could explore that trail that goes up Bald Mountain. I watched her face carefully as I said it, looking for any reaction. For just a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. Then it was gone. That sounds wonderful, she said. I'll pack us a lunch. While she busied herself in the kitchenette, I quietly gathered supplies. Matches, a lighter, my grandfather's old pocket knife with its iron blade, and a small camping hatchet I'd brought for splitting kindling. If Elijah was right about fire and iron being effective against these things, I wanted to be prepared. We set out after breakfast, following a trail that led away from the river and up the steep slopes of Bald Mountain. The path was poorly maintained, overgrown with rhododendron and mountain laurel that formed a tunnel of green around us. Within an hour, we were hiking in near darkness despite the daylight above the canopy. Sarah, or the thing wearing her form, seemed unusually energetic, practically bouncing up the trail ahead of me. Her movements were just slightly off, too fluid, like she wasn't quite bound by the same physical laws as normal humans. "Slow down," I called. "I'm still not feeling 100%. She stopped and turned back to me, and for a moment her face was completely blank. No expression, no recognition, just a human mask waiting for instructions. Then the familiar Sarah smile returned. "Sorry, I'm just excited to see the views from the top." But I noticed she didn't sweat despite the exertion, and her breathing never became labored even on the steepest sections. Whatever this thing was, it was pretending to be human but didn't quite understand the limitations that came with flesh and blood. We climbed for 2 hours through increasingly dense forest. The normal sounds of the woods, bird calls, insect noise, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, gradually faded until we were hiking in an unnatural silence. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing sound. That's when I started seeing the others. At first, it was just movement in my peripheral vision. Pale shapes flitting between the trees, always vanishing when I turned to look directly. But as we climbed higher, they became bolder, less concerned with hiding. They looked like people, but wrong. One had Sarah's face, but the wrong body. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung past its knees. Another had my features but skin that was too pale, too smooth, like a wax figure that had been left in the sun. They moved through the forest with that same unnatural fluidity, never quite touching the ground. "Do you see them?" I asked Sarah. She followed my gaze toward the trees where I'd spotted one of the figures. "See what?" "Nothing. Never mind." But I knew she could see them. I caught her glancing toward the mimics when she thought I wasn't looking, and once I swore I saw her nod at something in the forest. A subtle acknowledgement, like recognizing an old friend. We were getting close to the nest. The trail eventually opened onto a rocky outcropping near the summit of Bald Mountain. Below us, the forest stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the silver thread of the Davidson River winding through the valley. It should have been beautiful, but there was something wrong with the view. The proportions were off, distances that should have been familiar looked strange, and the sky had a greenish tint that made everything look sickly. "Wow," Sarah said, but her voice was flat, emotionless. "What a view." I pretended to admire the scenery while scanning the area for the nest Elijah had marked on his map. According to his directions, it should be somewhere near the summit, in a place where the old Cherokee hunting grounds had been. That's when I heard it. A sound like wind chimes, but made from materials that weren't metal or wood. Something organic, wet, that clicked and whispered in harmonies that made my teeth ache. "What's that sound?" I asked. Sarah tilted her head, listening. "I don't hear anything." But she was lying. Her eyes had that alert, predatory look I'd begun to recognize, and she was unconsciously moving toward the source of the sound. I followed, hand resting on the knife in my pocket. The sound grew louder as we moved away from the overlook and into a grove of ancient oaks that seemed older than the forest around them. Their trunks were massive, their branches forming a canopy so thick that almost no light reached the ground. In the center of the grove was a clearing maybe 50 feet across, and in the center of that clearing was the nest. It wasn't like any bird's nest or animal den I'd ever seen. It was a structure made from bones and branches and things I didn't want to identify too closely, woven together in patterns that hurt to look at directly. It rose maybe 20 feet from the forest floor, twisted and organic, like something that had grown rather than been built. And hanging from its branches were dozens of cocoons. They were human-sized, translucent, pulsing with internal light. And through the semi-transparent walls I could see shapes inside. People suspended in some kind of fluid, their faces peaceful as if they were sleeping. I searched the cocoons frantically, looking for a familiar face, a particular build, anything that might tell me if Sarah was in there, and then I found her. Third row up, near the center of the nest. Sarah's face, unmistakable even through the cocoon's membrane. Her eyes were closed, her hair floating around her face like she was underwater. She looked peaceful, unharmed, but completely unconscious. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said the thing beside me that had been wearing her face. I turned to find that it was no longer bothering to maintain the illusion. Its features were shifting, flowing like melted wax, sometimes Sarah's face, sometimes mine, sometimes something else entirely. Its limbs had elongated, giving it an insectoid appearance, and when it spoke, I could see that its mouth was full of too many teeth. "How long?" I asked. "Since yesterday morning," it said in Sarah's voice coming from that nightmare mouth. "We took her while you were sleeping. She was so easy to copy. All that love, all that concern for you, very convincing emotions." Around the clearing, other mimics emerged from the shadows between the trees. Dozens of them, all wearing faces I recognized. My co-workers, my neighbors, my parents, everyone I'd ever cared about. But their bodies were wrong, elongated and pale, moving with that fluid grace that belonged to things that had never been truly human. "What do you want?" I asked. "To spread," the Sarah thing said. "To grow. To take your warm, bright world and make it ours." It gestured toward the cocoons. Each one of these was like you once, unique, individual, full of messy human thoughts and feelings. Now they're perfect, peaceful, and their forms serve us well. "Why the games? Why not just take us immediately?" The thing that had been Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Where's the fun in that? We enjoy the hunt, the slow revelation, the moment when you realize that everything you thought you knew was wrong." Its face shifted back to Sarah's, but the eyes remained alien. "Besides, we learn so much from watching you. Your fears, your weaknesses, the things that make you human. All very useful information." I looked up at the real Sarah in her cocoon, her face serene and unaware. "Is she alive?" "For now. We need the originals to maintain the copies. But eventually," the thing shrugged with Sarah's shoulders, "eventually we won't need them anymore." That's when I made my move. I pulled out the camping hatchet and swung it at the nearest support structure of the nest. The iron blade bit deep into the organic material, which screamed, actually screamed, like a living thing. Black fluid poured from the wound, smoking where it hit the ground. The mimics rushed at me from all sides, but I was already moving, using the hatchet to cut through the lower supports of the nest. Each blow sent vibrations through the entire structure, and the cocoons began to sway and pulse with agitated light. "Stop him!" the Sarah thing shrieked, but its voice was no longer human. It was the sound wind makes through dead trees, the sound of things rotting in dark places. I pulled out my lighter and set fire to the black fluid leaking from the nest. It caught immediately, burning with a green flame that sent the mimics reeling back in apparent agony. The fire spread quickly through the organic structure, climbing toward the cocoons. But the real Sarah was up there, trapped and helpless. I started climbing the burning nest, using the hatchet to chop handholds in the branches and bones. The heat was incredible, and the smoke burned my lungs, but I could see Sarah's cocoon just ahead of me. The membrane was starting to dissolve in the heat, the fluid inside beginning to bubble. A hand grabbed my ankle. I looked down to see the Sarah thing, its face a melting mask of fury and hunger. Its fingers had become claws, and they were digging through my jeans into the flesh beneath. I kicked at it with my free foot, connecting with what I hoped was its face. It released me with a shriek and fell back into the flames below. But other mimics were climbing up after me, their borrowed faces twisted with inhuman rage. I reached Sarah's cocoon just as the membrane burst, spilling her onto a platform of woven branches. She was unconscious but breathing, her skin pale but warm. I gathered her in my arms, feeling the solid reality of her weight, the familiar smell of her hair. Now I just had to get us both down from a burning nest surrounded by creatures that wanted to kill us. The mimics were getting closer, their claws scraping against the burning branches as they climbed. But the fire was spreading faster than they could move, and several of them fell screaming into the flames below. I looked around desperately for an escape route. The nest was collapsing as its support structures burned through, tilting toward the forest floor. If I could time it right. I waited until the structure was tilting at a steep angle, then pushed off with Sarah in my arms. We slid down the burning side of the nest like it was the world's most terrifying playground slide, crashing through smaller branches and landing hard in the leaf litter at the edge of the clearing. I rolled, trying to protect Sarah from the impact, and came up running. Behind us, the nest collapsed completely, sending up a pillar of green fire and black smoke that must have been visible for miles. The screams of the burning mimics followed us as we fled into the forest. Sarah came to as I was carrying her down the mountain trail, her eyes fluttering open to stare up at me in confusion. "Marcus, what happened? Where are we?" "It's okay," I said, though my lungs were burning and my muscles were screaming from the exertion of carrying her. "We're getting out of here. I had the strangest dream," she said weakly. "I was floating, and there were these voices calling to me, but I couldn't answer. Not a dream, I'll explain later." We made it back to the campground as the sun was setting, both of us exhausted and covered in soot and scratches. I helped Sarah into the RV and immediately started packing our gear. Every few minutes I caught myself looking out the windows, expecting to see pale figures emerging from the tree line. "We're leaving," I told her, "right now. But the reservation—" "Forget the reservation. We're going home." Sarah was too weak to argue, and truthfully, I think some part of her understood that something terrible had happened, even if she couldn't remember the details. She helped pack what she could while I hitched up the RV and prepared for departure. As I was securing the last of our gear, Elijah appeared from the shadows near his trailer. His pale eyes took in our soot-stained clothes and the urgency of our packing. "You found it," he said. It wasn't a question. "Burned it down," I replied. "But I don't know if that killed all of them." Elijah nodded grimly. "Probably scattered them at least. Bought some time." He handed me a business card with nothing but a phone number written on it. "Call if you see anything strange in the weeks to come. Sometimes a few escape." "What about you? Aren't you leaving?" The old man shook his head. "This is my post. Someone has to watch, to warn the next group of fools who think they're just going camping." I wanted to argue with him, to insist that he come with us, but I could see in his eyes that his mind was made up. He'd lost his wife to these things 40 years ago, and he'd been fighting them ever since. This was his war, and he would see it through to the end. We drove through the night, putting as much distance as possible between us and Pisgah National Forest. Sarah slept fitfully in the passenger seat, occasionally murmuring in her sleep about floating and voices. I kept the radio on for company, but even the familiar chatter of late-night DJs couldn't entirely dispel the feeling that something was following us. Every few miles, I checked the mirrors, looking for anything that might be tracking us. But all I saw was empty highway stretching behind us, lit by the occasional streetlight or truck stop. We made it home the next morning, pulling into our driveway as the sun was coming up over the suburbs. Our house looked exactly the same as when we'd left it. Red brick colonial with white trim, flower beds that needed weeding, newspapers piled up on the front step. Normal, safe, human, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brought something back with us. Over the next few weeks, I watched Sarah carefully for any signs that she wasn't really Sarah. I tested her with questions about our shared past, observed her behavior for inconsistencies, listened to her voice for that telltale echo. But everything checked out. She was definitely the real Sarah, traumatized by an experience she couldn't fully remember but still fundamentally herself. The dreams, though, those were harder to explain. She started having them about a week after we got back. Dreams of floating in green light, of voices calling her name, of faces that looked familiar but weren't quite right. She'd wake up gasping, her skin cold and clammy, unable to remember exactly what she'd seen, but terrified nonetheless. And sometimes in the middle of the night I'd catch her standing at the bedroom window, staring out at the backyard with an expression I couldn't read. When I asked what she was looking at, she'd shake her head and say she didn't know. Just felt like something was watching. I called Elijah's number once, a month after we got back, when I found muddy footprints around our house that didn't match any of our shoes. He listened to my description without comment, then told me to start carrying iron and keep a fire ready at all times. "They don't give up easy," he said. "You hurt them bad, But that doesn't mean it's over. He was right. It wasn't over. I'm writing this 6 months later, and Sarah is pregnant. She doesn't remember when it happened. The timeline doesn't match up with any night we were together. But the doctors say everything looks normal, healthy. Due date in 3 months. Sometimes, late at night when she's sleeping, I put my hand on her belly and feel the baby moving. But the movements are wrong somehow. Too coordinated, too purposeful, like something that's already aware, already planning. And when Sarah dreams now, she smiles. I've been thinking about fire a lot lately, about how easy it would be to arrange an accident, how much I love Sarah, how far I'd go to protect her from something that might be growing inside her. But what if I'm wrong? What if the paranoia is just leftover trauma from what we experienced in those woods? What if I'm considering something monstrous based on nothing more than fear and suspicion? The baby kicks again as I write this, and Sarah murmurs something in her sleep. For just a moment, it sounds like that bird song I followed into Pisgah National Forest. Complex, structured, almost like language. 3 months until the due date. I've hidden containers of gasoline in the garage, matches in every room. Iron nails driven into the windowsills and door frames. I tell myself it's just insurance, just being prepared. But I know what I'm really preparing for. And I pray to whatever God might be listening that when the time comes, I'll have the strength to do what needs to be done. The thing growing inside Sarah kicks again, and this time I swear I can hear it humming. Story 4. My name is David Chen. I'm 34, and the first star over the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest flickered like a warning light on a dying machine. I should have listened to that warning. Should have turned the RV around right there at the Spirit Lake Memorial Highway turnoff and driven back to civilization. Instead, I pulled into the Muddy River campground as the sun bled orange through the Douglas firs, thinking I was finally going to get the peace I'd been craving for months. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 weeks ago. Sarah kept the house in Portland. I kept the debt and this 28-foot Winnebago that we'd bought for the family camping trips that never happened. A fresh start, the therapist had called it. Time to rediscover yourself. What a load of shit. All I wanted was to disappear into the woods for a week and forget that my life had imploded. The campground was nearly empty. Just 2 other RVs tucked into sites across the loop road, their windows glowing warm against the gathering dusk. I'd specifically chosen this spot because it was remote, accessible only by a narrow Forest Service road that wound through old-growth timber for 12 miles, the kind of place where you could scream and nobody would hear you. I backed the Winnebago into Site 7, the hydraulic levelers whining as they adjusted to the uneven ground. The site sat at the edge of a small meadow, bordered by towering firs that had probably been standing since before Lewis and Clark passed through this country. Behind the RV, the forest pressed close, a wall of green shadow that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. As I connected the electrical hookup, I noticed something odd. Fresh cuts in the bark of the nearest tree, about chest high. 3 parallel lines, each about 4 inches long, carved deep into the wood. The sap was still sticky, beading amber in the fading light. Someone had been here recently with a knife or maybe a small axe. Probably just kids, I muttered, though the cuts looked too precise, too deliberate for random vandalism. They reminded me of something, but I couldn't place what. I finished setting up camp as darkness settled over the forest like a heavy blanket. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared, typical for late September in the Cascades. I started a fire in the steel ring, more for company than warmth, and cracked open a beer from the cooler. The flames danced orange and gold, casting shifting shadows on the trees. That's when I heard it for the first time. A soft, scratching sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere beyond the firelight. I turned toward the noise, beer can halfway to my lips. "Hello," I called out. "Someone there?" The scratching stopped immediately. Silence stretched out, broken only by the pop and hiss of burning wood. I waited, listening, but whatever had been making the sound was gone. Probably just a porcupine or raccoon foraging around. This was their territory after all. I tried to relax, letting the beer and the warmth of the fire work their magic. But something felt off about this place. The silence was too complete, too heavy. In all my years of camping, I'd never been in a forest this quiet. No owl hoots, no nightbird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just the fire and my own breathing. Around midnight, I kicked dirt over the coals and retreated to the RV. The interior felt cramped after the openness of the outdoors, but at least it was warm. I lay in the fold-out bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the Winnebago system cycle on and off. The refrigerator hummed. The furnace kicked in periodically. Normal sounds that should have been comforting. But underneath it all, I could swear I heard that scratching again. Soft, persistent, coming from somewhere outside. I told myself it was just the wind in the trees, branches scraping against each other. But the night was still. No wind at all. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to pale gray light filtering through the RV's windows. Dawn in the mountains, that liminal time when the forest holds its breath. I made coffee and stepped outside to check the fire pit. The ashes were cold, just as I'd left them. But something was different about the trees. More cuts, fresh ones, marching in a line along the trunks that bordered my campsite. The same 3 parallel marks, carved deep and weeping sap. I counted them as I walked the perimeter. 17 trees, all marked sometime during the night. My hands started to shake as I held the coffee mug. Someone had been out there while I slept, moving through the darkness with a blade, marking the trees around my camp. But why? And why hadn't I heard anything? I grabbed my phone to call the Forest Service, but there was no signal. The mountains blocked cell towers, and I was too far from civilization for the weak radio waves to penetrate. I was completely cut off. The rational part of my mind tried to find logical explanations. Maybe it was some kind of forestry survey. Workers marking trees for thinning or disease control. But what kind of forestry crew worked in the middle of the night? And why these particular trees, in such a specific pattern around my campsite? I walked to the nearest marked tree and examined the cuts more closely. They were fresh, the wood still bleeding sticky resin, made with something sharp, a knife or small hatchet. The cuts were too clean and precise to be animal damage. Someone with steady hands had made these marks. As I studied the tree, something caught my eye in the soft earth at its base. A footprint pressed deep into the damp soil. Bare feet, human-sized but wrong somehow. The toes were too long, the arch too pronounced, and there were more prints leading away into the forest, a trail of naked footsteps heading deeper into the trees. I should have left right then. Should have packed up the RV and driven back to Portland as fast as the old diesel would carry me. Instead, I found myself following the footprints. The trail led through dense undergrowth, winding between moss-covered boulders and fallen logs. The prints were clear at first, pressed into patches of bare earth and soft pine duff, but as I followed them deeper into the forest, they became harder to track. The ground grew rockier, the undergrowth thicker. After about a quarter mile, the trail led to a small clearing I hadn't noticed from the campground. In the center stood a single massive cedar, easily 8 feet in diameter and hundreds of years old. Its bark was covered with the same 3-line marks I'd found around my camp, but these were older. Some looked fresh, but others had healed over with new growth, creating raised scars in the ancient wood. The tree was completely covered with them. Hundreds of marks, maybe thousands, carved into every available surface from ground level as high as a person could reach. They covered the entire trunk in overlapping patterns, like some kind of primitive language or code. At the base of the tree, the ground was clear of vegetation, worn smooth by what looked like years of foot traffic. More barefoot prints circled the massive trunk, layer upon layer pressed into the hard-packed earth. And scattered among the prints were other things that made my stomach clench. Bones, small ones mostly. Birds, rodents, maybe a few larger animals. They were arranged in careful patterns around the tree's base, some bleached white by weather, others still stained dark with old blood. And hanging from the lower branches, suspended on thin strips of what looked like sinew, were dozens of small objects. feathers, stones, pieces of antler, things I couldn't identify in the dim forest light. I backed away from the tree, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't forestry work or kids playing pranks. This was something else entirely. Something old and deliberate and deeply wrong. The footprints that had led me here continued on the far side of the clearing, heading deeper into the forest. But I'd seen enough. I turned and ran back toward camp, crashing through the undergrowth without regard for stealth or noise. Branches whipped at my face and caught at my clothes, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to the RV, pack up, and get the hell out of here. I burst into the campsite, breathing hard, my heart still racing. The Winnebago sat exactly where I'd left it, solid and reassuring in the morning light. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking as I tried to unlock the door. That's when I noticed the new marks. While I'd been following the trail, someone, or something, had been busy around my camp. Every tree was now marked, not just the ones on the perimeter. The picnic table bore fresh cuts in its wooden surface. The metal fire ring had scratches gouged into its steel sides. Even the RV itself showed new damage. 3 parallel lines scraped into the aluminum siding near the door. But it was the pattern that made my blood turn to ice. The marks didn't just cover the campsite randomly. They formed a rough circle with the RV at the center, like some kind of boundary or containment spell. I managed to get the RV door unlocked and stumbled inside, slamming it behind me and turning the deadbolt. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the lock. I went to every window and pulled the curtains closed, then sat on the edge of the bed trying to think. Someone was watching me. Had been watching since I arrived, maybe even before. They'd waited until I was asleep to mark the trees, then followed me into the forest and marked the camp while I was gone. But who? And what did they want? I tried to remember if I'd seen any other vehicles on the Forest Service road. The 2 RVs I'd noticed when I arrived were in sights on the opposite side of the loop, at least 100 yards away. I'd been so focused on my own setup that I hadn't really looked at them closely. Maybe I should walk over there, see if anyone had noticed anything unusual, but that would mean leaving the RV again. Going back outside where whatever was marking the trees could see me. I spent the rest of the morning huddled inside, jumping at every sound. The RV's systems seemed louder than usual. The refrigerator cycling, the water pump clicking on when I ran the tap, the furnace blower moving stale air through the vents. But underneath it all, I could hear other sounds. Soft footsteps circling the RV, the scratch of something sharp against metal. Around noon, I worked up the courage to peek out through a gap in the curtains. The campsite looked normal in the bright daylight. Birds sang in the trees. A squirrel chattered from somewhere overhead, but the marked trees stood like silent sentries, their carved symbols dark against the bark. As I watched, movement caught my eye at the edge of the forest. A figure stepped out from behind one of the larger firs, tall, pale, walking with an odd, stilted gait. From this distance, I couldn't make out details, but something about its proportions seemed wrong. The arms, too long, the head too small, the way it moved too fluid and predatory. The figure stood at the tree line for several minutes, perfectly still, facing the RV. Even though I couldn't see its face clearly, I had the unmistakable feeling it was staring directly at me, watching, waiting. Then it stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. I let the curtain fall closed and sat back on the bed, my whole body trembling. What the hell was out there? And what did it want with me? The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. I tried to distract myself with books, with the RV's small television, but nothing could shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow that moved past the windows made me flinch. Every sound from outside sent adrenaline surging through my system. As evening approached, I faced a terrible choice. I could try to leave, pack up and drive out in the dark, following the narrow Forest Service road by headlight. But that road was treacherous even in daylight, full of hairpin turns and steep drop-offs. In the dark, it would be suicide. Or I could stay another night and hope that whatever was out there would lose interest and move on. As the sun set behind the mountains, plunging the campsite into premature darkness, I made my decision. I would stay, but I would be ready. I found the camping knife in one of the RV's drawers, a 4-inch fixed blade that Sarah had insisted I pack for emergencies. Fat lot of good it would do against whatever was marking those trees, but it made me feel slightly less helpless. I also found the emergency flare gun I'd bought but never used. 3 flares in a waterproof case, designed to signal for help in the wilderness. If things got bad enough, maybe I could use them to create a distraction, or scare off whatever was out there. As full darkness settled over the campground, the sounds started again. Footsteps circling the RV, slow and deliberate. The scratch of claws or blades against the aluminum siding. And something new. A low, humming sound, almost below the threshold of hearing, like the vibration of power lines or distant machinery. I sat on the bed with the knife in one hand and the flare gun in the other, trying to track the sounds as they moved around the RV. The footsteps weren't random. They followed a pattern, the same circuit over and over again, clockwise around the RV, pausing at each corner, then starting the circuit again. Around midnight, the sounds stopped. Silence stretched out, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the hammering of my heart. I waited, every muscle tense for the sounds to resume. Instead, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Scratching, coming from directly above my head. Something was on the roof of the RV. I looked up at the ceiling, following the sound as it moved from front to back, then side to side. Whatever was up there was big enough to make the whole RV sway slightly with its movement. And it was doing something to the roof, scratching or cutting, the same deliberate rhythm I'd heard the night before. The sound moved to the corner directly above the bed where I sat. I could hear it clearly now, metal scraping against metal, like claws or a blade scoring the RV's aluminum roof. Then the scratching stopped, replaced by a different sound, tapping. 3 sharp raps, then silence. 3 more raps, then silence again. It was trying to communicate. I sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe. The tapping continued, always the same pattern. 3 raps, pause, 3 raps, pause, like some kind of code or signal. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I reached up and tapped 3 times on the ceiling. The sound stopped immediately. For a long moment, there was complete silence. Then the thing on the roof began to move again, but differently now. Instead of the slow, deliberate circuit, it scuttled across the surface with rapid, skittering steps, like a giant spider or crab. The whole RV rocked with its movement. Then it was gone. I heard something drop to the ground beside the RV, followed by footsteps moving away into the forest. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on the edge of the bed with the weapons in my hands, listening for any sound that might signal its return. But the forest remained quiet until dawn. When pale light finally crept through the curtains, I worked up the courage to look outside. The campsite looked normal, unchanged from the day before. But when I stepped out of the RV to examine the roof, I found fresh scratches in the aluminum. Not random damage, but the same 3-line pattern I'd been seeing on the trees. And beside the RV, pressed deep into the soft earth, was a single handprint. Human-shaped but wrong. The fingers too long, the palm too narrow, the thumb on the wrong side. I was examining the print when I heard an engine starting. One of the other RVs across the loop was pulling out. A middle-aged couple in a big Airstream. They drove slowly past my sight, and the woman in the passenger seat stared at me through her window. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with what looked like fear. They knew something. Had seen something. I ran after their RV, waving my arms and shouting for them to stop, but they accelerated, disappearing around the curve that led to the main road. Their taillights faded through the trees, leaving me alone with whatever was in the forest. The 3rd day passed in a haze of exhaustion and paranoia. I tried several times to start the RV and leave, but each time I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't even turn over. The battery was charged, the fuel tank was full, but the Winnebago was dead. I popped the hood and examined the engine, but I was no mechanic. Everything looked normal to my untrained eye. But when I tried to remove the battery cables to check the connections, I found that someone had scratched the same three-line symbol into the battery casing. Fresh cuts in the black plastic, still sharp enough to snag my finger. Whatever was out there didn't want me to leave. As the sun set on my third night in the campground, I prepared for another sleepless vigil. But this time, I had a plan. If the thing came back, if it tried to communicate again, I would try to make contact. Maybe I could find out what it wanted, why it was keeping me here. The sounds started just after dark, the same pattern as before. Footsteps circling the RV, the scratch of claws against metal. But tonight there was something different in the rhythm, something more urgent. When the thing climbed onto the roof, I was ready. I stood in the center of the RV's main compartment, looking up at the ceiling, listening as it moved from front to back. The tapping came from directly overhead. 3 raps, pause, 3 raps, pause. I tapped back 3 times on the ceiling. The response was immediate. A flurry of scratching sounds like the thing was excited or agitated, then more tapping, but different this time. A long series of rapid strikes, like Morse code. I couldn't understand what it was trying to say, but I tapped back anyway, matching its rhythm as best I could. The exchange continued for several minutes, the thing on the roof becoming more animated with each response. Then it stopped. Complete silence stretched out above me. When it spoke, its voice was like nothing I'd ever heard. Human words, but the tone was wrong. Too high, too hollow, like air being forced through damaged vocal cords. "Come out," it said. "Come see." My blood turned to ice. The thing could talk, had been listening to me, learning from me. "What do you want?" I called back, my voice barely a whisper. "Come see," it repeated. "Come see what we've made for you." The scratching resumed, but different now. Purposeful, methodical. The thing was cutting something into the roof, carving with quick, precise strokes. After several minutes, the sound stopped. "Come see," the voice said again. Then I heard it drop to the ground and move away into the forest. I waited until dawn before stepping outside to look at the roof. What I found there made me sick to my stomach. Carved into the aluminum in precise, deep lines was a message. Not the 3-line symbols I'd been seeing, but actual words scratched into the metal. Marked for the forest below. The words was a crude map, showing the campground and the surrounding area. My RV was marked with an X, and radiating out from it in all directions were lines leading to other X marks scattered throughout the forest. Dozens of them. Other campsites. Other people who had been marked. I was looking at a hunting map. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't the first person to camp here and encounter whatever was in the forest. There had been others, lots of others, and they were all still here somewhere, marked and claimed by the thing that carved the trees. I ran back into the RV and grabbed the emergency radio from the storage compartment. It was an old model, analog with a hand crank for power, designed to work when nothing else would. I cranked it frantically and tuned it to the emergency frequency. Static filled the small speaker. I adjusted the antenna and tried again, cranking harder. "Mayday, Mayday," I called into the microphone. "This is David Chen at Muddy River Campground in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. I need immediate assistance. There's something in the woods. Something dangerous. People are missing. Please respond." Only static answered me. I tried different frequencies, cranking the radio until my arm ached. Nothing. Either the radio was broken or something was interfering with the signal. As I was about to give up, I heard something that made my heart stop. A voice came through the static, faint but unmistakable. "David," it said. "David, can you hear me?" It was Sarah's voice, my ex-wife, calling my name through the emergency radio. "Sarah." I grabbed the microphone. "Sarah, is that you? How are you?" "David, you need to come to us." Her voice was clearer now, cutting through the static. "We're all here, waiting for you, in the forest. It's beautiful here, David. Peaceful." "Sarah, what are you talking about? You're in Portland. How are you?" "The trees are singing, David. Can you hear them? They're singing about you, about us, about the family we could have been." Her voice was wrong. The words were Sarah's, but the tone was off. Too flat, too hollow, like something trying to imitate human speech. "Come to the big tree, David, the one with all the marks. We're waiting for you there. All of us." I switched off the radio with shaking hands. Whatever was out there wasn't just marking trees and hunting campers. It was learning from them, taking their voices, their memories, using them as bait. The fourth night was the worst. The thing didn't come back to the RV, didn't circle or scratch or tap on the roof. Instead, I heard voices in the forest. Lots of them. They called my name from different directions, using the voices of people I knew. Sarah's voice, pleading with me to come out. My father's voice, telling me he was proud of me. My college roommate, my first boss. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years. But underneath the familiar voices was something else. A quality that marked them as wrong, as copies made by something that didn't understand human emotion. The words were right, but the feeling was absent. I huddled in the RV with the curtains drawn, my hands pressed over my ears, trying to block out the chorus of stolen voices. But they seemed to come from inside my head as much as from the forest. Around 3 a.m, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, so complete it made my ears ring. Then I heard something that was worse than any voice. Footsteps on the RV's metal steps, slow, deliberate, climbing toward the door. The door handle turned. I'd locked it, thrown the deadbolt, even wedged a chair under the handle. But the lock disengaged with a soft click and the door swung open on its hinges. Cold air rushed into the RV, carrying the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. And standing in the doorway was something that had once been human. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the darkness. Its limbs were too long, jointed in places where joints shouldn't be. Its face was human in basic structure, but wrong in every detail. Eyes too large and dark, mouth too wide, filled with teeth that were sharp and numerous as a shark's. But it was wearing clothes, tattered remains of hiking gear. A flannel shirt that might once have been red, jeans torn and stained with things I didn't want to identify. And around its neck, on a thin chain, hung a small silver cross. It had been human once. Someone like me, who had come to the forest looking for peace and found something else entirely. "Hello, David," it said in Sarah's voice. "I've been waiting for you." I raised the flare gun with trembling hands and pulled the trigger. The flare exploded from the barrel in a burst of red light and sparks, striking the thing in the chest. It shrieked and stumbled backward, its inhuman cry echoing through the forest. But it didn't fall. The flare burned through its shirt, illuminating the pale skin beneath, but the creature showed no sign of real injury. It looked down at the burning phosphorus embedded in its chest, then back at me with those huge, dark eyes. "That wasn't very nice," it said, still using Sarah's voice. I scrambled for the second flare, but the thing moved faster than anything should have been able to move. One moment it was standing in the doorway, the next it was beside me. One elongated hand wrapped around my wrist. Its skin was cold and damp, like something that had been underground for a long time. Its grip was gentle but absolutely unbreakable. "Come with me, David," it whispered. "Come see what we've built for you." I tried to pull away, but it was like struggling against steel cables. The thing lifted me effortlessly and carried me out of the RV into the night. The forest was alive with movement. Dozens of figures emerged from between the trees, all tall, all pale, all wrong in the same fundamental way as the thing that held me. But each wore the remnants of human clothing, carried some token of their former lives. A woman in a torn wedding dress, her face a grotesque parody of human features. A man in a business suit, his briefcase still clutched in one malformed hand. Children, or things that had once been children, their school backpacks hanging from shoulders that bent at impossible angles. They formed a procession around me as the first creature carried me deeper into the forest. None of them spoke, but I could hear them breathing. A wet, rasping sound that reminded me of bellows or damaged lungs. The procession led to the clearing with the massive cedar, but it looked different now. The tree itself was unchanged, still covered with its thousands of carved marks. But around its base, someone had built structures. Shelters of a sort. lean-tos and small huts constructed from branches and pine boughs arranged in a rough circle around the ancient tree. And sitting in front of each shelter were more of the pale creatures, watching our approach with those huge dark eyes. Some wore the clothes they'd died in. Others had fashioned crude garments from animal skins and plant fibers. But all of them had once been human. Campers, hikers, hunters who had come to the forest and never left. The creature carrying me set me down at the base of the great cedar. Up close, I could see that the carved marks weren't random. They formed patterns, spirals, and interlocking designs that seemed to shift and flow in the moonlight. "Welcome home, David," said the thing that had taken me from the RV. It was still using Sarah's voice, but I could see its true form now. The way its joints bent backward, the way its spine curved like a question mark, the way its fingers ended in points that were too sharp to be nails. "What do you want?" I whispered. "To keep you," it said simply. "The forest is lonely. It needs caretakers, guardians, people who understand its secrets. You're killing people, making them into this. We're saving them." The creature gestured toward the others gathered around the tree. They were lost, wandering in the dark. We gave them purpose, family, forever. As it spoke, I noticed something moving in the shadows behind the shelters. More figures, but these were different. Human-shaped but smaller, moving with quick, scuttling motions. Children. What had once been children. The full horror of it hit me then. These things hadn't just been taking random campers. They'd been taking families, parents and children, transformed into these pale, hungry things that built their twisted community around the marked tree. "How long?" I asked. "Time moves differently here," the creature said. "Some have been with us for decades. Others are new, still learning. You'll learn too, David. The forest will teach you." One of the child things scuttled closer, and I saw with sick recognition that it wore a small t-shirt with a cartoon character on it. Mickey Mouse, faded and torn but still recognizable. How long had this child been missing? How many search parties had combed these woods looking for him? "Let me go," I said. "Please, I won't tell anyone about this place. I'll just leave and never come back." The creature tilted its head, studying me with those black eyes. "But you're already marked, David. The trees know you now. You belong to the forest." It was then that I felt the burning sensation on my arms. Looking down, I saw that red lines were appearing on my skin. 3 parallel marks, just like the ones carved into the trees. As I watched, they deepened and darkened, becoming permanent scars. The marking wasn't something they did to you. It was something the forest itself did, a claim that couldn't be broken. Fight it, I told myself. Find a way out. But even as I thought it, I could feel something changing inside my head. The terror and revulsion I'd been feeling began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of peace. The forest was beautiful, I realized. Quiet and safe and eternal. Why had I been so afraid? "That's right," the creature whispered. "Let it happen. Let the forest take you." The other beings moved closer, forming a circle around me and the great tree. They began to hum, the same low sound I'd heard outside the RV. But now I could hear the harmony in it, the way their voices blended together into something almost musical. They were singing, a lullaby for the lost and the lonely, a song to welcome me home. I found myself humming along, my voice joining theirs in perfect harmony. It felt natural, right? Like this was where I'd always belonged. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice screamed in protest. Sarah's voice, but the real Sarah this time, not the hollow imitation. She was telling me to run, to fight, to remember who I was. I grabbed onto that voice like a lifeline and forced myself to think. The flare gun. I still had 2 flares left in my pocket. Moving slowly, trying not to attract attention, I slipped my hand into my jacket and found the plastic case. The creatures were focused on their song, swaying gently in time with the music. Even the thing that had brought me here seemed entranced by the melody. I pulled out the flare gun and loaded the second cartridge as quietly as I could. The creatures continued to sing, their eyes closed in blissful concentration. I aimed at the base of the great cedar and fired. The flare struck the trunk and exploded in a shower of sparks and burning phosphorus. The ancient bark caught fire immediately, flames racing up the massive trunk and spreading to the lower branches. The singing stopped. Every pale face turned toward me, their dark eyes reflecting the growing firelight. "He burns the heart tree," one of them said in a voice like grinding stone. "He burns our home." The creature that had carried me stepped forward, its face no longer wearing any pretense of humanity. "You don't understand," it hissed. "The tree holds our souls. If it burns—" I loaded the third flare and aimed at the largest cluster of branches. "Then maybe you'll finally be free." The second flare turned the upper part of the tree into a torch. Flames leaped from branch to branch, spreading with impossible speed. The carved symbols in the bark glowed like molten metal as the fire consumed them. The creatures screamed then, a sound like tearing metal and breaking glass. Some fell to their knees, clutching at their chests as if in physical pain. Others began to change, their pale skin cracking and peeling away like old paint. "Run," I whispered to myself. "Run now." I turned and crashed through the circle of beings, pushing past creatures that were too stunned by the burning tree to stop me. Behind me, I could hear them beginning to give chase, their inhuman cries echoing through the forest. I ran through the darkness without any idea of direction, branches whipping at my face and roots trying to trip me at every step. The forest seemed to close in around me, paths disappearing and new obstacles appearing in my way. But I could smell smoke now, see the orange glow of the burning tree reflected in the sky above the canopy. The fire was spreading, and with it came a wind that carried the sound of things dying. I found the creek by falling into it, the cold water shocking me back to full awareness. Following the stream downhill, I stumbled through the forest until I saw lights ahead, the glow of RV windows and the cold white beam of a flashlight. The campground. I'd made it back, but my RV was gone. In its place sat a Forest Service truck, and beside it stood a ranger in full uniform. When he saw me crashing out of the woods, bloody and torn and wild-eyed, he reached for his radio. "Base, this is Henderson. I found him. I found the missing camper." Missing camper? How long had I been gone? "Sir, are you injured? We've been looking for you for 3 days. 3 days. But I'd only been in the forest for 1 night. Unless, what's the date?" I asked. The ranger looked at me strangely. "October 15th, sir. You were reported missing on October 2nd. Your ex-wife called when you didn't return from your camping trip. 2 weeks. I'd been in that clearing for 2 weeks, though it had felt like hours. As the ranger helped me to his truck, I looked back toward the forest. The glow of the fire was still visible above the trees, but it seemed smaller now, more distant. And in the smoke that rose from the burning, I could swear I saw faces. Pale, anguished faces finally finding their way to whatever came next. The marks on my arms had faded to thin white scars by the time they released me from the hospital. The doctors said I'd suffered from exposure and dehydration, complicated by what they called acute stress reaction. They recommended therapy. I didn't tell them about the tree or the creatures or the voices in the forest. Who would believe such a story? Instead, I let them think I'd gotten lost, wandered in circles for 2 weeks before finding my way back to civilization. But I knew the truth, and sometimes, late at night, I could still hear the singing. The Forest Service closed the